Okay, getting started. Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to our newest deep dive on the vector sequencer. As you saw on the still earlier, I'm going to be participating in Gear Dive Jam in May.
You want to tell us more about that, Jim? Gear
Yep,
Dive Jam?
just let me wrangle a little bit of a YouTube thing.
Perfect.
Okay, there we go. There we go. All right, sorry about that. I had the live stream playing in a separate window, and it's, a few seconds behind, so it's a little disconcerting. Anyway, technical issues aside, it is, from what I understand, I'm going to be preparing a short piece, and we'll be playing that on the live stream. And Steve, you're participating as well, I see. And Dissonant, who I've not met yet, but also has a vector, and then we're just going to hang out and chat about stuff. So it'll be interesting. And today our special guest is David Soto, also known as Sine Mountain. Hey, David.
Hey, how's it going, everyone?
All right, thanks for joining us. And a little bit on short notice, but so tell me a bit about your musical self, but also the Colorado Modular Synth Society, which is a very active group up in Denver area.
Yeah, so thanks, Jim. Thanks for having me on, and congratulations for 2.0. That's awesome achievement.
Thanks.
Super excited to be here for that. I can't wait to hear what everybody's going to be doing with it. But yeah, so my name's David Soto. I go by Sine Mountain. I've been into the Eurorack since I say the winter of 2018. Is when I got started, and I soon got involved in doing events and participating in Colorado Modular Synth Society. And I've just been kind of running events every month since, even during the whole pandemic thing. I've been running events, so yeah, it's been really fun. I started off like a lot of people with just some very small, a few things, a 19-inch rack, a semi-modular, had a no coast, that kind of thing. I wanted, like a lot of people, I just wanted to play with something more tactile and explore something else. And after doing years of DAW stuff and stuff, so I come from like a hip hop background, so I kind of know those instruments from back then, and so jumping into modular was definitely the opposite side, because I wanted to explore doing more experimental stuff and generative things. That was really interesting to me. I wanted to just have a real creative flow with less restrictions. So that's what kind of drew me to it, and I just kind of grew and grew and grew, as you can see, and definitely being part of this of the group, and doing and seeing a lot of modules come through the group. It's definitely not helped me slim that down, but yeah, and that's kind of like me. And so I'm kind of going through a journey, as an artist, learning about myself and kind of developing, what that sound is, and or what am I gravitating towards, what story am I trying to tell with my music. And at the same time, I spend just as much time working on Colorado Modular Synth Society, which is a lot of time, and I get inspired by those conversations that I have with people, whether it's talking about gear or it's just talking about life. It's one of those communities that's definitely transcended just nerding out, We,
Mm-hmm.
we
Mm-hmm.
have a lot of deep discussions about everything from, politics to, you know, being a parent to whatever, So it's all over the place. It's been a really great, rewarding experience and really amazing thing to be a part of.
So tell me how working when you moved to the modular, and you've been working with modular for a while now, how that changed your approach to music.
Yeah, I in my head I had a mission to do something very emotional and yet less structured, and part of that was coming from my background and just doing, before I got into hip hop, I was doing punk rock. I was always trying to do something really expressive, and I wanted to see what I could do with modular, because all the examples I saw, they all seemed very, well, these are stuff that I was drawn to, was all the really experimental stuff, and I really
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
loved the feeling that was giving me when I was watching it. So that was what I was going after. Like, I wanted to have those sort of krill kind of patches and think, ooh, what's going on, um, and let people think about it and get drawn to it, and just get lost in those weird textures.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I started, and I'm still there in a lot of ways. But what's happened over the last 6 months, I would say, is I got kind of interested in music theory. I went back and I thought, I'm breaking a lot of rules, and I know that, but I honestly don't even know these rules. So modular has been one of those things that, oddly enough, has been teaching me more about music theory than any attempt at trying to learn it, with traditional instruments.
Mm-hmm.
So, sorry, Jim, can I just jump in for a sec there?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so David, that's a really interesting point. What is it that you feel about when you started producing music on the modular that made you sort of want to dive more into some of the relationships between how those things work?
Yeah, it probably started with the ornaments and crime.
Yeah,
And you start playing around with those scales, and I was playing around with
yeah,
all the chord apps and stuff, and then learning about the relationship with chords and and finding out that those things on that sequencer or those sequence apps were all, were left field. And I was like, well, left field of what? And I didn't really get it until I started to dive into it and start watching more videos or pay attention to people who have that background.
yeah. It's a very natural way to sort of get into that exploration, and a good one too. A great module for all of those functions as well, by the way. So yeah. No, great.
Yeah.
And what you were saying about community before, I think, is extremely good. And you mentioned inspiration as well. And certainly, where I am in Melbourne, Australia, being observing what you guys in the Colorado, the synth scene have been doing with building that community and creating those events has been really inspiring too. So, thanks for sort of being a bit of showing that sort of leadership in the scene is kind of, I guess, it's going to rub off on other people too. So
Yeah, I hope so. I hope so. Like when we started doing our meetups, we would get occasionally people would come in from out of town. We would definitely for those people who don't know or haven't been to Colorado, Denver's kind of in the center, but there's obviously there's Boulder, there's Fort Collins, there's Colorado Springs, and then there's the whole summit, and then there's a lot of space. So it's so for people to come up or down or across to visit us from a different part of the state for those meetups, that was really eye opening too, because it was where else you're gonna go. It was a big deal. We don't have a store. There's not a store
right.
nearby. The Guitar Center barely even stocks up on the cork stuff. So I mean, it's there's not much to do. So we would get people coming in from other parts of the state, and then eventually we start getting people coming in from outside the state, which was amazing. Someone would say, "Hey, I'm from Nebraska. I'm going to plan my trip to Colorado. Are you guys doing anything?" And they would anchor our meetup to their trip, and that two couple things happened when that happened. Is one, and it's super humbling, to be a part of that, someone's travel, vacations, whatever. But it also made me really want to always be there if they wanted to start something in their community, if they wanted to do something in their corner or their neighborhood or something, to always let them know that we're here to support that and foster that, because you don't have to wait till my monthly meetup to get together. We have online forums. This is pre-pandemic, and
Yeah.
so it had some use to it, but there's nothing like being able to get together with someone down the street and literally nerd out about your synth.
Yeah, fantastic. No, it's absolutely fantastic, and yeah, it's obviously you guys adjusted to the new way of communicating really well because I attended some of the sessions at one of your events, and it was just fantastically run. You sort of moderated it and everything really well.
I appreciate that. Yeah, that's so the pandemic obviously fast forwarded a lot of people's plans, and being online was something that people were always requesting. And so we we did that, and the nice thing was that we had some great conversations and relationships that we were starting to build with people like DivKid and Heimbach, and having these really good. We were trying to figure out how to work with them by coming into the state, and now they couldn't come into the state, or nobody could travel, so we were able to have them jump onto some of our early meetups, and that helped
Yeah, nice.
that helped get some momentum on that. And now if you go to our Discord, it's I wouldn't say that people from Colorado are in the minority, but it's it's getting close. We have a lot of people from around the world, um, as part of that. So I always say Colorado's a state of mind, and as long as you if you buy a sticker from us, you're officially from Colorado. So,
But you don't have to drink the Chords beer. I'm being reminded by one of my friends here.
yeah. We saw your post about the cores, and I think
Yeah, I'm sorry.
The state collectively with.
I've been banned from Colorado forever, but no, I got to say that the Coors beer I tried was brewed and packaged locally in Australia, so it's our own fault for it being the way it was. Let me just put it diplomatically.
It's all good.
Need that Rocky Mountain water.
Yeah, yes, indeed. All right, I'm done there, Jim. Thanks.
Well, I brought up the YouTube page for the Colorado Modular Synth Society. There's a lot of stuff going on here, and it just this explosion of online streams and performances has just been amazing. And Freak Boutique in particular is well, now kind of an international event, right?
Yeah, that's another event that was it was there was debates on, like, should we keep streaming it live, or Alex would always say, Alex Nasty Nachos, who runs that pretty much. And then when we went online, he took it online, and we started to become a part of that by helping with getting people registered for it. We were building a community online, so we were directing people to that. And so just for the last few months, we've been kind of working together. We do a announcement together of who gets to play on the show, and we do whatever we can to support each other, because I think, if anything, definitely, like, we're closer with a lot of our friends, and Alex and pretty much the whole WMD crew is active in the CMSS forums, and they've participated with a lot of us. So and if it wasn't for them, honestly, I think that we wouldn't probably be where we are, because that Freak Boutique monthly was kind of our hangout, our performance, our stage for the region. There's nothing else like it in the area, and I don't mean that just by Colorado. I mean, it's like in the area. So it's pretty awesome to see it go online. And now I think last show had like 3 people from Canada in there, which is amazing.
Yes,
so fun.
Yeah, always such a wide variety of good music, and it is nice that as an online event, and hopefully will stay at least a hybrid event, is that the ability for people to participate from anywhere. And speaking of events, you guys have another big one coming up called April Skies, and so tell us a little bit about this one.
Oh yeah, so I have no shortage of ideas for events and concerts and concepts for shows. As you can see from our YouTube, we're trying all kinds of things. But so the Sky series is coming from a couple different things. We started this in October to do a space music show. That's kind of something that's kind of a birthday gift to myself in October, because before the pandemic, I mean, We did. I put on a show at a place called Space Gallery, and we did experiments with music. It was really fun, and so I wanted to do that again. So I was like, let's just do modular synth space music again, and invite people to play that. So we did one in October, one in January, and this next one's on April 25th. And yeah, it's really cool. So space music might mean a few different things to people. I mean, I grew up listening to space music on public radio, and was really inspired by that. Hearts of Space. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so I kind of wanted to keep that going, but with modular, and so that's kind of what I asked these folks is kind of like take your interpretation of space music and do a performance for it. So yeah, this is a cool list. Actually, this is gonna be there are 3 artists on there who are playing with Buchla. So that if you want to see some cool Buchla action, we have some artists that are going to be doing that. You guys all know Travarsi, but you probably never seen Travarsi do an ambient set like this. This is like, I mean, she doesn't do very many ambient sets anyhow, but this is like,
Mm-hmm.
it's amazing. It's so great. And then I'm really excited for some people to check out some of these other names that they might not have seen before. So I try to always try to, have some people that, in there that we have heard from. So there's some recognition and people can kind of know what to expect to a certain degree, and then put some people in there for people to discover. Because again, it's one of those things that when you're running a community, you got to kind of always balance that playlist.
Yeah,
Excellent.
definitely. And having Brian on there as the Aphonic, he's a busy guy lately too, isn't he? He's sort of popping up all over the place doing his performances.
Yeah, Brian's one of
great.
those guys. He's one of the very early folks I met when I got started in this, and so watching him develop his modular rig and his sound has been amazing, and he's always been a really great friend. He actually played the original space show that we did live way back in 2019. So it's good to have him back on here. Yeah, he's he's busy now, so I love it. It's good to keep Brian busy.
Yes, keep him away from the shopping cart checkouts and playing some music.
Oh,
It's,
you guys have
amazing.
no idea. You have no idea. When we first I don't know. I don't want this to become a Brian show, but like, yeah, when he first started, he would definitely show up on the forums with a mother load of, look, this is what I got, and we all be like, what?
Nice.
Yeah, I'm sure every scene has a few of those folks who
Yeah,
just-
down here, it's anytime I want to know more about a module, I ask Chris Meyer and says, "Do you have this one yet?"
yeah, I love it. Those are really, especially when you don't live near a store. That's like huge, right? I had actually Mike Thomas used to live next door to me before he moved, and he was that kind of guy too. He had a verbose system, he had a mutable system, he had a surge system, and so being able to go over there and get hands on with those, wow! I mean,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
just learn so much.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's such specialty equipment, and it's so hard to find in a lot of places that's really how all the meetups started, right? It's like, hey, I've got this cool thing, and let's get together and check it out. And it's moved more, including live performances, and it's just been a great scene. All right, and we have David. We have some of your music queued up for a little later. This is from just a few days ago, I think, on Twitch at the New York Modular Society.
Yeah, I played at New York Modular Society. They do weekly shows, and one of them is called Off the Grid, which is what you probably imagine it's going to be like. It's very kind of explores a lot of experimental stuff. So that was really fun to play on that last Thursday. So yeah, it's a good time.
Oh, we see Brian's in the chat field, so we have to tell him we've been talking about him and say hi.
Hey,
And
Brian.
so we're gonna dive right in with some demos for all the new stuff in 2.0, and there's some overlap with things that are already in the vector, and but we've got a few good cool demos set up, and we'll run through a couple of those and have a little music break, and then a few more, and then another music break, and I'd say probably the marquee feature for 2.0 is support for the Launchpad, which I've got a Launchpad X behind me. This is a Pro, and I've got the Mini over here on my demo system. And the idea behind adding this is that it allows us to have more of a control surface for the vector to handle things that the vector UI organization doesn't handle quite as well. So, the Launchpad has a lot of buttons and they have lights so they can show their status. And on the vector, it's this, let's wake this guy up, it's the displays and knobs thing. So it's a nice complement, and the Launchpad mapping is designed so that it gives you kind of an overall control center. And Steve will be talking about that, and we'll be splitting up the Launchpad portion into several different sections. It's actually a fairly detailed mapping. And with that, I guess, Steve, are you ready for us to hand it over?
Yes, indeed.
Okay.
All right, so look, thanks for that. Excellent summary there, Dave. Great chatting as always. So what I'll just go to my OBS and just maximize the view of the appropriate camera. Just give me a second. And here's that one. Sorry guys. All right, here we go.
All right.
So what you should be able to see right now is my vector sequencer, as well as the Launchpad X over in the top right corner there. So what I'm just going to run through, and a few of you already know this, but we're just going to start with a bit of an overview of the session page here. So what the session page presents to us on the Launchpad, and I'm using the Launchpad X, and somebody asked in the chat what are the recommended Launchpads that we should use. The general rule of thumb is use one that's in production currently today, so that'd be your Launchpad X, your Mini Mark III, and the Pro as well. But other people equally are having good results with some of the older models too. So if you've got one in the cupboard somewhere, feel free to give it a go. But the most successful results we've seen, support-wise, have been with the new models. I like the Launchpad X because it's got velocity sensitivity plus all these beautiful colors and everything. Fantastic. So without further ado, session page is this page. You select pages using the top row up here, the 4 pads on the right, and also on the right column here, you've got some vertical pads, which is start and stop. So if I push this button, I will get, when I unmute, a beat, which is fantastic. So I can start and stop from here without having to reach over to touch the vector. The red button is for record mode, and we'll get to that a bit later on. But what you've got here is this 8x8 grid on the Launchpad. I'm going to be talking about the rows as vertical and as horizontal. Vertically, as in the columns, the 8 rows refer to basically the 8 parts on the vector. So the vector has 8 parts you can set up, and each of those vertical rows refers to a part. The multitude of colors across the top here, well, they refer to the colors that you've already configured on your vector for the LEDs. And you might not have consciously configured them because they come with some, factory colors already. But if you do color the LEDs on the vector, those colors will be, mirrored over here as closely as possible. So that's the 8 parts. I've got some monophonic parts set up. I've got a chord part set up on 6 and some drum parts set up on 7 and 8. So that's the top row there. It sort of aligns you with where you are in your project for the parts. The second row is about record mode. And when the buttons are blue, it means that that part is not in record mode. But if I push one of the buttons, it switches it to record mode. Jim will be talking a bit more about record mode later, as will I, and we'll get to that in due course. The third row here is your mute and active row. Red means mute, green means active. So let me just mute all of them. Being they're all red, they're all muted. I'm going to unmute 3 and I'm going to press play. And get a bit of a synth line going. Okay, so I can start and stop from over here, and if I go... you can hear that I'm muting and unmuting various parts and so on using that row there. So that's a great little arrangement tool as far as... sometimes I use that for sporadic little rhythms coming in and out, just muting and unmuting to get them into the piece. Further to muting and unmuting, you've got these 2 rows here, which are rows 4 and 5 on the Launchpad. Now, this is a bit interesting. If you've been playing with the Vector for a while, you'll know that you can set up chord and drum modes in addition to monophonic. Chord and drum modes are interesting in that they have 4 voices each, and in a chord that can be 4 different notes for a chord, and in a drum that can be 4 different drum sounds for a drum, I guess, kit, or a part, a drum part. So if you think about 4 parts that are capable of chords or drum parts and 4 voices each, you come up with 4 by 4, which is 16. It's no coincidence, therefore, that this section of 2 rows is broken into 4 lots of 4. You can probably see where I'm going here, which is that these 4 are for one of your chord or drum parts, these 4 are for another, and so on with these and this. And how that works is because your chord and drum parts can be assigned as parts 5, 6, 7, or 8, these 4 different zones are denoted into those numbers. So this is part 5, this is part 6, this is part 7, and this is part 8. So if you are configuring a chord voice on part 5, this is note 1, 2, 3, and 4 of your chord voice. If you're configuring a drum part on part 8, this is 8.1, 8.2, 8.3, and 8.4. And I'm just going to reach over to my vector sequencer, go to the routing page, and you can see there that it's got 7.1 to 4 and 8.1 to 8.4 there as well. So these pads here refer to those parts. And what do they do? Well, if I enable a drum part, or drum parts, I can then mute voices within that drum part. So I've muted all except the kicks in 2 different drum sections, and I can come back in, which is pretty cool. So basically those 16 pads enable you to mute and unmute voices. And imagine that with a chord voice. You could be sending a chord out to your polysynth or to whatever device you're using, and then just gradually reveal the notes that you're sending to create some interesting effects. I find that a really great way to sort of come up with compositional ideas.
Yeah, it is great, Steve. On that note, with the chords, as you're outputting those to a poly device, you can have one note turned on or all 4 turned on, and that can be controlling your arpeggio for that poly device. Or if you turn off the root note, you're left with the remaining 3 notes or some variation. So you're right. It's nice to get some improvisational variations in there just with a couple of buttons.
Yeah, that's a really great point, Cody, and you did bring my attention to that a little while ago, that yes, if you're sending out an arpeggio to your Moog or to your polysynth or whatever else, you could be doing exactly that, muting and unmuting notes that populate that arpeggio, and that's just loads of fun, especially coupled with some kind of time sync to delay. Anyway, yeah, good times. Rows 6 and 7, Cody's going to be going into a bit later because they're the scenes mode, and Cody's a bit of a gun with scenes mode. But what scenes mode is apparently it's similar to Ableton, which I don't use, not for any religious reasons. I just don't. I use Cubase. But those 16 pads allow you to choose different scene arrangements. And I've only got one scene set up at the moment, and that scene is a selection of presets, and we'll be talking about presets in a second. So a scene is basically a collection of presets across your parts, and those 16 buttons, should you choose to initiate them, which I haven't, allow you to select a scene, which is a collection of presets. And that is quantized. So if I push a button, another scene, that's quantized to how you've got your project and your parts set up. So if your parts are set up to swap or change at the end of a bar, that means that when you press the button, it'll wait till the end of the bar, and then that scene will swap for each of those presets. You sort of have to play with it to see how that works, but sometimes people have an issue where they might have one part to quantize to change on bars and another changing some other way, and then they don't change in sync. So that's just something to keep an eye on. It does what you tell it, in other words. The final row is a really interesting one. I'm just going to push that button there. So if you can see my vector screen's changing as I'm pushing these buttons. And that's the great thing about the Launchpad, is it doesn't replace the vector sequencer as a controller. It just adds a whole bunch of functionality and a really easy interface for it. Having said that, it does bring some new things in, like the muting for drum parts and the muting for chord parts is not available natively on the vector as a controller, but it is available on the Launchpad. So there are some really smart things put in there that are unique to the Launchpad control. Now, this here is your dashboard view. So if I push the blue button over here, it takes me back to the start, the start step for a preset. If I push the second one, it comes to length. If I push the third one, it goes to direction. I just had an aha moment yesterday when Jim pointed out that, in fact, that row of dashboard buttons, if I push Control, the yellow button on my vector sequencer, you can see that it says Start, Length, Direction, Reset, Rate, Mode, Octave, Transpose. In fact, those dashboard buttons on the Launchpad, that's the order that they will bring things up on your screen. So why is that useful? Well, say that I want to manipulate the direction of a couple of my sequences or patterns at once. I would go to this screen, the direction screen, and I can then on my vector use the encoders to change those directions forthwith for all of those parts at once, rather than having to switch into each part individually and get onto it that way. So that's a bit of an overview of the session page. Remember, the top row is how you select your pages. Over here is your start, stop, and your run button. The vertical columns are your parts, 1 to 8, and then you've got your different zones, which I've described. And they're all in the 2.0 manual, which Jim has dutifully updated. Always grab the digital version, because there's always little minor tweaks here and there too. So check that manual out. Now, before I shut up, which I will, I'm going to go to the preset page briefly. I've selected that by pushing what is the note button on my Launchpad X. It could be written differently on yours. But what this shows is presets that I've got configured in my project. There aren't terribly many in this project, but what I'm going to do, you can see that I've got 2 different presets here. What I'm going to do to start with is just play between these 2 different presets. So if I go back here and press run, now that blue one's active. If I select this one, it's blank, so it's, oh, here we go. Yeah, so that one's actually a copy of the other one and it's blank, so that's not a good example there. Cody will run through a bit more with the presets as well. But basically within the preset page, what you've got is the ability to say, okay, if I go back to my drum part over here, I go to part 7, I've got a preset, and I do shift and that. I've now created another preset. I've now created another preset. So what I'm able to do is then go into, say, the pitch mode and put a couple of extra kicks over here. So what that's going to enable me to do is go back to here, press play. So that one's got the extra kicks in it. Duck, duck, duck. And you can see that's quantized for when I'm selecting. Alright, it's a really great arrangement tool, and one I think that you can sort of see the value of pretty easily. Alright, so I've run through those first 2 pages. Presets page is wonderfully useful when you want to change presets within a part, and that relates to scenes where you choose groups of presets at a time. So there's a whole lot of easy to get into control mechanisms here. And if there's no questions from the panel, I'm done with that section.
I'll just add real quick to that dashboard. It's one of those things that gets kind of overlooked, probably.
Yeah.
But it's really useful when you're troubleshooting, because if you're like me, you might come back to a patch and maybe you haven't got a chance to use it in a few days, and then you start playing everything and you're like, wait, something's off. I don't know what's going on. And if you bring up that dashboard, you're able to see all those different things, and you might see that, oh well, one of my voices is going backwards when I thought it was going forwards. So I think that's another really great use of that dashboard.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic, and it is something that I overlooked for a while until I'd had a couple of wines on a Saturday night, and I was just jamming away with these couple of monophonic patterns, and it's amazing what you can do creatively just with a couple of tweaks with start and length and things like that with existing patterns that you're enjoying to make them a bit more interesting. So yeah, get into it.
Yeah, I recently just performed, the other day, and I didn't use the Launchpad, and I had to kind of remember where certain things were at inside of the like which part had what, which scene and stuff. So I was really missing my Launchpad at that moment, because this visually, when you're performing, obviously, you're kind of your mind's racing and you can forget that stuff. So using that as a visual cue to know, oh, okay, I'm in this preset or whatever, is super helpful when you're playing in a dark space live.
Yeah, I got one Launchpad, and then when I realized I had to get a second one for my other rack as well. So it's like, okay, great. Now they're populating. So
no, that is kind of the really the goal of the session page in general, right? Is that the layout is simple enough that you can at a glance see what's going on across all your parts. If something's muted, you need to unmute it, you can do that quickly. You can use the dashboard to jump in and check a few things, or to, you know, do some improvisation across two parts at the same time. And yeah, super handy, because, you know, particularly because it's nice just to have it set over to the side. And particularly if you have a big system and you have a complicated performance, you can have your scenes going and flip between scenes very easily on the Launchpad. And yeah.
Yeah, very good.
Let's see. Next up was Cody. We'll give him a couple minutes to get his stuff running. I also should point out that I started pushing some tutorial videos on the YouTube page. There are 3 up now. It's in a playlist called Vector 101, and the idea is to basically cover pretty much everything that's in the manual, all the basic stuffs. And then the deep dive videos are great for kind of seeing things in more of a context of, you know, I'm building a track, and these are ways I can combine different features to get something done.
All right. Hey, you got me there, Jim?
Yep.
Wonderful. Well, I'm ready to fire off whenever you guys are ready for me.
Absolutely. Go for it.
Great. Well, thanks everyone again for joining us for the Vector 2.0 release party. And as Steve mentioned and covered briefly on some of his demonstration, I'm going to focus a bit on presets, playlists, and scenes with the Vector, and specifically how they work with each other. And if anybody's following along or would like to in the manual, you can refer to this section on page 18. And with that, we'll go ahead and start. So waking up my Vector as well. We can look at the global page, and I'm going to start with my playlist section turned off, and we'll take a view at our presets in the parts. But first, I'll explain what parts I'm actually using today. So with this particular scene, we've got part 1, part 3, part 7, and part 8. And each of those parts are allocated to different voices in the patch. Part 1 is going to be allocated to the impulse command, which is featured here. Nice little analog mono synth from Analog Solutions. And then I'm also utilizing Ableton Live as my sampler, and my sampler only. And we can view that here. So I'll just kind of give you a quick tour of what I'm using here in Ableton Live. Primarily, it's used as a mixer and a sampler. So I bring all of my signals into Ableton, and I set up everything with my sampling devices in Ableton, so I don't have to really rely on rack samplers or hardware samplers. It's kind of a way for me to get all of my signals in, mix everything, and process them together. That being said, I've got a couple of drum parts allocated to drum samples in Ableton, featuring a mix of kicks and snares and some hi-hats on part 8. So with this, I'll switch back over to my vector view. And I'll go ahead and give you a quick run of the sequence and give you an idea of what kind of sounds you're actually going to hear.
Profound visual activation. How do you explain out-of-body experiences?
So the bass line's being generated from the impulse command, and the drums are all coming from Ableton, and the occasional vocal sample is going to be featured in Ableton. So going back to my presets, you can see that I've got a handful of presets allocated on my impulse command channel. I've got part A, and I've got part A2, or preset A2 rather. And then over here on part 7, I've got drum 1 and drum 2 featuring my kicks and snares. And on part 8, I've got my hi-hats on A1 and A2. And if I mute individual voices, you can kind of hear things on their own. Simple drum pattern, simple hi-hat pattern, pretty simple bass pattern. Now, if you start with something simple like this and you're looking for a way to explore, or you have another part to that you would like to transition to, or a fill perhaps, what I like to do is incorporate the playlist feature so that I can navigate between my scenes. So if I build a scene out of part 1 A1 and part 7 drum 1 and part 8 A1. That's effectively what we refer to as a scene. It's playing all three of those parts simultaneously in each of their presets simultaneously. And then if you want to add that fill or kind of create a little bit more drama, you can enter into what we call playlist mode. Now I've already arranged my playlist to play presets 1 across all my parts 3 times, and then it'll switch to pattern number 2 or preset 2, scene 2 across all of my parts, and then it'll play through that 1 time and switch back to the first part. So now we're going to go ahead, I'm going to stop my sequencer for a second, turn playlist on, and effectively create
How do you explain
movement.
out-of-body experiences?
And if you watch the Launchpad view, you can see them switch positions from scene 1 to scene 2. Pretty straightforward, plays through 3 times, and then on the 4th time, it's effectively a fill. And now what I have set up on my 3rd part is just some simple vocal samples. So while I'm playing through my playlist setup on scenes 1 and 2, I can kind of manipulate and have a little bit of improv on my 3rd part that's not involved in a playlist.
Brain's only got 3 choices. It can be awake, like many of you seem to be. Rapid, eye, movement, sleep. How do you explain out-of-body experiences?
So it's kind of neat to be able to insert some sample control from another device, have your playlist running with a little bit of variety, and then leave some room.
The hallmarks of that are
For improv.
profound visual activation. Out-of-body experiences is actually part of the REM system. How do you explain out-of-body experiences?
So
Okay.
Cody,
Yeah, go ahead.
Cody, I have a couple questions real quick if you don't mind. I think people are going to be asking, like, how are you hooking your sequencer up to Ableton? Are you going like USB? Are you using a module to connect? And then my follow-up question, if you will, is when you were sitting there and you were playing your playlist, as you were kind of making some improv choices and changing those, the adding a different, say a different preset, when it loops back, is it going to like remember that you did that, or will this go back to its original state?
Good question. Okay, so I'll start with the first question. I'm essentially just running out of my jack expander into my Motu MIDI timepiece, and I do all of my MIDI management for my system in the MIDI timepiece. I have a hybrid system that features a lot of MIDI instruments along with my analog modular instruments. So via the jack expander MIDI out into my Motu MIDI timepiece, and via USB from the Motu MIDI timepiece, I go straight into Ableton, and then I route everything from the vector. It's kind of a bit of complex routing to achieve all of the different effects that I like to accomplish with MIDI routing. And on my jack expander page, you can see that I've got part 1, 2, 3, 4 appropriately all up to part 8 routed out of the jack expander, and they're all set to their own individual channels. And this might be a deeper conversation, but channel 1 respectively to channel 1, or part 1 respectively to channel 1, part 2 to channel 2, part 5 channel 5, 6 is on 6, and that is my first drum mode part, and I have that set to spread across channel 6, 7, 8, and 9, and then part 7 and part 8 are respectively on 15 and 16, and each of those are allocated in Ableton Live to the respected MIDI input channels, and then I'll route in Ableton any additional MIDI output routings if I wasn't already able to cover it on the vector, but it's pretty much one-to-one on my outputs in Ableton.
Just a note for anybody watching who's not familiar with this page is that it's very hard to capture the reverse video and the OLEDs on most cameras and still have enough exposure to see everything else, but the channels are indicated in the white text blocks above each part name, and you can edit the channel by holding down the shift button and turning the encoder. So if you turn the encoder by itself, it changes what part is assigned to basically any of those 8 slots. We have 8 generic slots available for routing a part to a MIDI output. And then if you hold down the shift button and turn the encoder, it will set the channel that part is for. So you can even have a part go to 2 different MIDI outputs and 2 different channels. Or in Cody's case, all 8 parts are on the same MIDI output but on different MIDI channels.
That's correct. And I went ahead and switched back over to my Ableton screenshot, and you can follow my mouse along, and I'll kind of articulate what Jim just mentioned there with the screenshot of Ableton. So if we're looking at my drum parts, which is part 7 on my Vector, and part 8 is my hats, I'll illuminate those on Ableton Live for you and open up the MIDI setting. So it's currently selected MIDI timepiece number 8, which is what my Vector is routed to via the jack expander MIDI DIN connection.
Yeah, nice one. Nice one.
And then the channel in Ableton is allocated to channel 15 on the MIDI timepiece cable plug number 8. Now, you can do this directly with the Vector via USB. I just have a lot of MIDI devices that require the MIDI timepiece, so I've got 8 things actually patched for I/O for that, so it just helps me with my management. But it's absolutely effective via USB, especially with the 2.0 release.
Fantastic. Sorry, Cody. Brian Horsfield's got the Aphonic's got a question. Cody, do you have to mess around with the delay settings in Ableton to ensure that the external gear in the Ableton instruments are properly in time? And then he's written, actually, I can see now that you do. So I'm glad that I read that.
I accomplished that in a couple of ways. And David, I'll get back to your question on the preset management. But to finish up on Brian's question, I do track delays and I do MIDI delays. There's a few ways you can accomplish getting this to sync up, and everyone's settings are going to be specific to your system, your sample buffer settings, your computer, your everything.
Cody, can you switch back to your Ableton view so we can just kind of, I mean, it's a big screen, but okay, yeah, we can see you have track delays set up for almost all the tracks.
Yeah, and on the track delays, those are more appropriately used for the samplers in Ableton because my buffer settings, I have managed to get everything synced up pretty nice and tight with my clock settings and buffer settings on the front end and sample rates and such. So there's minimal latency. But whenever I want to stack my Ableton drums with my analog modular drums, which are not quite featured in this patch, and unfortunately I won't be able to show that demo today, but one will come soon, then I'll utilize that track delay, which is appropriate for my system, to sync up with my analog gear so that the kick is actually stackable on top of the kick without any flamming or sample phasing issues and things like that, to get pretty sample accurate recordings and playbacks. And to further dive a little deeper into Brian's question, the primary reason that I choose to route my signals through Ableton is, since I'm using the DAW as my mixer, I use a Motu 16A to bring in 16 channels of various stereo and mono sources, and then I submix them in Ableton, and I'll scroll over to my audio channels here.
Great, thanks very much for that, Cody. That's fantastic. I think I'm going to shut up in a sec. What's great here is you use this setup completely different to the way I do, so that just shows the breadth of what you can do with the Vector as part of your rack. And over to the next question from David.
Yeah. I'll wrap up on the Ableton thing real quick. So the way that I output, I use 2 separate interfaces. And featured in my overhead shot, occasionally you can see my DJ mixer that lives below the Vector. So I use the Motu 16A as my input only device, and then I output via 4 stereo mix groups in Ableton, which are over here on the master side section. So I've got effectively 4 master channels that return to the 4 stereo master channels on the DJ mixer. So I can have beats on one, synths on 2, samples on another, etc. So it's a nice way for me to have more improvisational mix control over my setup. And with the DJ M900, I can output to 2 separate computers. So I can have Ableton running on one and my Zoom session running on the other USB output. But back to David's question and getting back to the Vector demo here. I'll go ahead and run the sequencer, and I maybe answer the question with a couple of movements here, David, because I've got a third scene set up here. I actually have 4, but the 4th doesn't really contain much data on it. But primarily the playlist is alternating between scene 1 and scene 2. And I have a third scene here that is not allocated to a playlist. So we'll kind of go in and out of those.
Out-of-body experiences. How do you explain out-of-body experiences?
A little more chaotic, just some variations. It's not set to a playlist or anything, so it's kind of doing its thing by itself until I allocate the scene to change.
How do you explain out-of-body experiences?
And since I'm allocated to change scenes on beat instead of on reset with my scene change, it can be pretty instantaneous, or you can change in the middle of a pattern, if you will.
Out-of-body experiences. How do you explain?
So you can count to 7 and then hit on the 8, and it'll queue up the next section. So I'm not sure if I answered your question directly there, David, but I think if I remember it correctly, you were asking if I input something else into a new scene location, and I go back to my playlist scenes, will it remember the playlist data? Is that the question? Do I remember it correctly?
I believe that it was, Cody. If David's not. Yep.
Yeah, I think that is what he was trying to ask, is whether or not entering into a new scene, will it affect the previous playlisted scenes?
Yeah, that's it.
And the answer to your question is the playlisted scenes will remain playlisted as long as your playlist is turned on in global. And if you wanted to add playlist control to your new scene, it's fairly simple, and I can show you that here. I'll go ahead and stop the sequence for a second, and we're going to view our drum part in preset mode. So when you hit your preset button, you can edit your preset and playlist functions by utilizing the previous button. And this is intentionally placed so it's not an accidental push while you're performing live. So if you're going to utilize this feature, learning the previous button enters you into the... Hang on, I'm going to switch my camera view back over here. There we go. So we're back in... let me back out. So I chose the part that I wanted to edit here in my preset for the playlist function. So we're going to go to part number 7, select preset mode. And the button that I was referring to is the previous button on the lower left-hand corner here. Now we're in preset edit, as you can see at the top. And this is also a great spot where you can kind of manage your presets. For me, it's helpful to label my parts and to understand... it helps me understand which part I'm actually playing. You know, the vector is going to default to A1, A2, etc. And when you need a little bit more organization, or just, I personally just need that. So on part 1, I've labeled it drum 1, rather on preset 1, I've labeled it drum 1. And on preset 2 for part 7, I've labeled it drum 2. And looking at preset 1, you can see that I have it allocated to play for 3 bars, and then it will go to drum pattern 2. And when we scroll up our preset number with encoder number 1 to preset number 2, you can see that I have it allocated to play for 1 bar and then loop back to drum pattern 1. And it's going to infinitely make this loop. And that's what we see with the Launchpad here. You can watch the scenes kind of bounce back and forth. So it's on scene 1, and then now it's scene 2. And all of that's managed from the preset edit page, where you can name it, title it, tell it its playback feature functions, and whether or not it's going to infinitely repeat, play 1 time, play 32 times. There's a number of variations here. So if I want to incorporate preset number 3, which isn't currently labeled, I'll show you real quick how to do that. I'm going to label this drum 3 just by turning my encoders.
Cody, there's a shortcut I probably haven't told you about. If you hold down Shift and turn one of those encoders when you're naming a preset, it will jump through all the vowels, which is a surprisingly useful way to move quickly through the alphabet.
Oh yeah, look at that. That is super handy now that I
Yeah.
want to just modify
And that
something
also
pretty quickly.
works on file names and part name edits.
Oh,
I
that's
didn't
cool.
know that either, so we could put that one in the calendar too. If yes, anyway,
Yeah,
that's a
that's
great one.
great. All the
Today's vector edit tip.
Yeah, the shift button. So right now we've got the preset 3 for drum part 3. It's labeled and it's currently just set to play forever. So it's not going to do anything besides infinitely repeat on itself until we ask it to do something else, or tell it rather. So we can say play for 1 bar. I'll keep it pretty short, and then it'll loop back to the beginning of our sequence. So this will effectively be 3 drum arrangements, then a fill, then call it a bridge, and then it'll switch back to the main arrangement.
Gee, Jim, I just noticed you just kind of like have you've got a little Easter egg there for someone to think about. What's the difference between forever and infinite?
Oh God.
Well, you can either play forever or you can loop infinitely, but you can't do both.
There it is.
Paradox.
And just a little UI comment. Cody, if you press the preset scene button repeatedly, it flips between those two very important pages. And the reason that preset edit is not in that stack is to basically avoid if you're particularly likely to use these two pages in a performance. And I wanted to have the preset edit page to be a little bit kind of off to the side, and that's why it's under the previous button. And you can also use previous and next to flip between all 3 of those pages, if I remember correctly.
Yes, that's correct, Jim.
Yeah.
Which is super handy, I would say. Not having it directly accessible on the main button that I would go to if I'm programming or trying to improv, and maybe I don't have a Launchpad. This is a way that you can still dial in your scenes and your presets and playlists without having the external controller. We all love the Launchpad. Anyone who gets their hands on it is immediately a convert, I find. But for the folks who maybe don't have space in their rig or the desire for it, this is effectively an alternative that you can manipulate your scenes from, which is nice, because prior to the Launchpad, this was the only way. But you can see here some of the behaviors that are happening between the first scene and the second scene. It's also illuminated here on the OLED of the vector. And if we switch to part number 3,
Out-of-body experiences.
then it'll switch back to part number 1 here. At least on the drums, because that's the only one that I programmed to alternate.
How do you explain?
And then back to part 1, it'll go back to
experiences?
its looping playlist feature that we have programmed for. Unless we have any more questions in the chat room, that kind of covers what I have set up for this so far.
I have one more question. Sorry,
Sure.
Just call me Mr. Question. What? This might be a dumb question. Can you copy scenes?
Yes.
Yeah, let's go ahead and walk through that. If
All right, so you can copy scenes and presets, and let me see if I can walk Cody through this. This will be interesting. So you hold down the edit button and press select.
I have to find the select button. There we go.
Yeah.
There we go.
And that copies the scene.
All right.
And then dial down to an empty one and do edit and skip to paste it.
Ha! Look at
There you
that.
go.
How easy.
You can also insert. So Cody, go ahead and edit scene 4 so that it's different from scene 3. Just change anything. Yeah, just so we know it's... Yeah, good. And then dial up to scene 3. And then hold the edit and press the mute button.
That's
Look at that.
game changer right there, Jim.
Yeah,
Seriously.
so that should be enough that if you've you've been working through an arrangement and you're like, oh shit, I needed one more variation in scene like 5, right? You can basically dial it up to scene. Well, say it's put an insert on scene 4. You dial up to scene 4, and then you can hit edit and mute to insert, and it will duplicate the scene, the current scene, to the slot after it and push all the others back.
Yeah, that's gorgeous.
Yeah, and you know, I'd love to update the front panel to include that on the front panel. That's with anything hardware, it's kind of long-winded to do that. We might even do a sticker pack of some sort so people can add stickers for that.
I would love that.
Yeah, and then that works for presets as well. So you can copy and paste presets, and you can insert presets.
Wow, that's great, because I think a lot of us sometimes just keep working, and then being able to go back and say, okay, now I want to rearrange it and actually move your compositions around, that'll be huge.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I'm trying to kind of coalesce is something of a roadmap to help new people like decide, well, when do I start using this? When do I start using that? And kind of the general idea that I like to promote is you just start improvising and making presets, and just kind of keeping your favorite ones and getting rid of the ones you don't like, and then being able to copy and paste them helps a lot. And then after you've kind of set up your overall set of patterns with the presets, you can go into the playlist editor and maybe automate moves between some presets, just as Cody has shown. And then when you're ready to to play out, you start building up your scenes. And and also if you go onto YouTube and look at the Learning Modular YouTube channel, or on Steve Roach's channel for his playlist for Sound Quest Fest, which was last month, and look at Chris Meyer, also known as Alias Zone, and he uses the Launchpad and scenes on the Vector to basically as a live arrangement tool, so he can focus on the many other instruments that he's playing at the same time.
So one final question, well, maybe not final, but one more question. So as he's doing all those different updates and you're playing around with the scenes and presets, is it, if I power down right then, would it save all that, or should I be hitting Shift Save before powering down?
So auto save happens when you stop the transport, either locally or from an external sync source, or if you do it manually. So if you're if you're in that kind of the habit of you run the sequence and you're editing and you hit stop and you have autosave on, it'll autosave each time you stop. And that the idea is to just make it so that goes on in the background. The reason it doesn't save while the sequencer's running is that SD card performance varies widely, and you can't guarantee that there won't be any glitches. Hopefully I eventually learn the drivers well enough I can adjust them to guarantee that, but it's pretty tricky.
One of the things that I see in the chat room, which I was going to mention a moment ago before I switched camera angles, page 25 and 26 reference some of the shortcuts that Jim was mentioning a little while ago, especially with the copy and paste and some of the shift functions. So page 25 and 26 are going to be super handy for reference on those.
Yeah.
Great one. That's a great summary there, Cody. The question came through from Mr. Nasty Nachos. This is probably more directed at Jim, but and it comes up from time to time about functionality on the Launchpad, etc. Things like Launchpad Pro's duplicate and clear buttons to copy playlists. I assume those do not work from the Launchpad Pro, because the profile that we use on the Vector is specific to that setup, yeah?
Well, I haven't added any what I call extra grid support on the Pro yet. That's something I'm making notes about. So
okay.
Thanks, Alex, for bringing that up. That's actually a pretty useful mapping to have. And again, that's something that is nice about the Pro. Steve was on my case last week about having both play, stop, and record buttons always available. And the which way is up on this way is up. So this is a Pro, and it's a little hard to see with this lighting, but there are all these extra buttons to the bottom and the side. So these are all things that can be mapped out now that we've kind of covered all the basics.
So you mean I have to get a Launchpad Pro now and increase your stock shares in Novation some more?
He's got a garage full of Launchpads.
Oh man!
I've got at least one of every Launchpad. I've got two of a few of them. But again, anybody who doesn't have one is thinking about getting one. get one of the new ones. They work better. The colors are beautiful. Their USB-C connections are nice and solid. We had some issues with the older Launchpads people were using that they just weren't making solid connections, and the older ones are often not RGB, and the mapping just doesn't look that great. So, I kind of went with, well, what do I really recommend as opposed to, what's possible. And the new models they're fast, they respond well, they're reliable. We're really happy with them.
Awesome.
Very good.
And so we're going to have a little musical interlude here. This is Sine Mountain from just a few days ago. Let me... that's there, and let me get the screen share going. So we'll play a few minutes of this excerpt. Oh, wait, I forgot I always have to add... share sound. Okay, good. It's the thing about Zoom, all these extra little settings.
They need a Launchpad.
Yeah, they do.
For Zoom.
Okay, has everybody got sound?
Yes.
Excellent. So
Wow, that was lovely.
Yes.
Yeah, really
Thank
pretty
you.
sounds.
Thank you. Yeah. So I'm super excited about the Vector. One thing that really like drew me to it was it having a keyboard on it. That was like huge. So I do have like a key step now, but I sometimes will just not even bother hooking it up and just play those keys. So that, playing that a lot was really fun. So I usually do that in most of my performances. I'll just play the keyboard. Now with the Launchpad, I have been messing around with using that keyboard function, which is definitely way more useful. But I still think that the one that's on there is great for kind of using for launching stuff, and definitely doing like stuff with transpositions and stuff like that. It's just so hands on. It's nice to be right there in front of your sequencer and being able to use that. The other thing that I wanted to kind of say about that was I had this idea of using the vector in a skiff format, basically kind of just out of like an idea that's been going around a lot in conversations with lots of folks about, do I need more modules? What can you do? I need more stuff. I'm always thinking about that, and putting a vector in a skiff for a lot of people might not make sense, because they're like, oh, it's too much HP. But I think it's totally worth it, because being able to put it in a skiff, kind of forces at least me to kind of think about, well, what else can I connect to it? So in that performance, I had a Preen FM2 hooked up to it as well, and then I was MIDI controlling the bitbox, and I could MIDI control actually the Dust of Time, but I decided to use gates and stuff, CVs into that. But anyhow, I just think that like it doesn't need to be, a vector doesn't have to be in a huge system. It by itself with just one or two modules, you could do so much with it. So that's kind of like my selling speech on doing a lot with little.
Yeah, I agree to that point as well. Having the vector in a skiff, I mean, I could take the vector in a laptop, and have VCV rack or Ableton, or the vector in a couple of handful of sampler modules. And I see it go in large racks, and I see it in skiffs, and I think I'm on the skiff train. But to the folks that do have them in their large racks, the Launchpad is such a huge selling point, because now you have this tactile thing in your skiff mode. So you've got the thing to touch and manipulate, while the brain is effectively buried in cables. It just kind of depends on your preference. But yeah, I hear you on the skiff train. I like it.
We're all about skiffs over here. My own systems are typically very small because I like to be able to move them around, and and I have skiffs coming up, cases for the vector, and hopefully have an announcement in a few weeks. Just waiting on a few details to get sorted out. And yeah, I think it is interesting I mean, Steve has a big system that's kind of a big sonic palette, and that's definitely a nice way to work. But it's also, particularly for people that are new to modular, nice to work with a small system, or maybe a couple of small systems. I tend to do a lot of things the way it's so David is working with pedals and modular, and I'm a big fan of that approach. It can have, it can cause all kinds of headaches in terms of level matching, but you can get some really interesting results, right? And so yeah, it's something I think, particularly for people that are new to modular, is to don't think that you have to get a big system. You can start really small.
Well, that's the thing. It's sorry, yeah. I'm in a fortunate position in that I've got two vectors. I use one in my production system, which is the big system, and I've got a test one in a smaller skiff type system. And it's funny because when I do use the vector in the smaller system, where I've got a tone star as a single voice, I've got a disting EX, which Mr. X in chat was referencing as a good option for a small system, and he's right. I control that with MIDI to get the multi-sample voices going on. So in that small system, I've got the tone star, the disting EX, and I've got an O-coast hanging on the side. So I've got basically two analog synth voices plus the disting plus a rample squawp sampled sort of drum sounds. And I mean, just in that small setup, I can create huge amounts of stuff, especially the two mono parts interacting against each other and having some fun there. So it's it's equally valid in either scenario.
Yeah,
And
and I mean, I have a sort of larger system behind me, and I definitely use it in that situation too. And I think that's yeah, I think it's super versatile. I think you know, thinking about it for a lot of people who are just getting into it, who think that they won't be able to do it, be able to accomplish, that it's simply not, it's not really true. You can do a lot. Nothing wrong with having a big system. Nothing wrong with having an orchestra. Sometimes, though, you can do a lot with just a quartet. So,
Nice
it's
one.
yeah, it's absolutely true. And more to the point of having the vector kind of close to me, I started out with it in my system, and I found myself not maybe using it as effectively as I could once it got closer to me. The things that I have in my skiff, I pretty much handle all of the time, and they get the most of my attention. And I think the vector for my system kind of deserves that amount of attention and having it close to me as my primary objective, because I can utilize the velocities and the subsequences and some of the outputs to basically recall my patch effectively in ways where, part 1 through 8 are primarily the same sound source on each of those parts. So when I switch between projects, it's just a few knob movements, and now I've got my patch alternated between both projects. But to the point of the big system versus small system, that's the beauty of modular, is everybody can do it exactly the way they see fit for their unique needs, and every rig is different. So it's lovely to see everyone's approach and utilize their influence on how I move forward with the vector. So it's nice to hear all these different variations.
Well, the other thing I do in the big system too, and Michael Kohler sort of pointed out something that sometimes you might use the vector to only control a few voices, and that's equally true. I might use the O coast, sorry, my ornament in crime, another OC, ornament in crime, to sequence some things, or the Euclidean circles, or any number of other sort of triggering sequences to sort of pair with the vector to create some interesting diversions, and then you get your resets sort of thrown around them around your modular, and you get some really interesting interplay. So yeah, great fun. Yeah.
All right, it's my turn on the demo stand, so I'm gonna
Excellent.
flip cameras here and get everything managed cables so I don't knock anything over with my headset. All right, so I'm gonna briefly talk about the edit pages on the Launchpad, and then I'm going to talk about recording modes. So on the Launchpad mapping, there are 4 main pages: session and presets, that Steve already talked about. And unfortunately, Novation thought it was a good idea to change the names of the buttons on every Launchpad, so the names of the buttons are a little different on every Launchpad. The 3rd page is keys, which is a keyboard. We'll get back to that in a little while. And then the 4th page is actually a pair of pages. When you first push on the menu, which is the user button, you have a navigation page, and for each of the 8 parts you have a lit button, and allows you to select that part for edit, and you can press user to get back, select a different part for edit. I'm just going to edit what I have for part 1, and part 2 is muted, so I'm not even sure what's on here, but let me get my system going here.
Love that reverb.
Yeah, that's the Mercury 7 hiding down in a little niche. So I'm actually going to clear out this pattern on the vector. And the way the page is organized is the top row are your octaves. So when I select a different button on the top row, I'm moving which octave I'm editing in. And then the bottom 7 rows are the 7 notes in a major or minor scale, or any of the church modes, which have 7 actual notes. So if I look at the mini keyboard on the vector and I ignore the C and just look at the white keys, we have C, D, E, F, G, A, B. And if I push those buttons,
Hey Jim, are you full screened?
I did it again.
It's alright.
There we are. See, I always
Excellent.
remember when it's someone else, but
I
when
know.
it's me,
I had that
always
on my
forget.
bingo card. I had that on my bingo card. So.
As
Everybody-
it was popping up, I was like reaching for the key as I saw it. So yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
Everybody have a drink. All right, so I can edit notes on the vector. I can edit the notes on the Launchpad. I can, if a note is active on the Launchpad, I can push the button to clear it out. And so this is a different way to edit. I don't tend to use this method much when I have the vector available, but it's actually an interesting way, particularly if you're improvising a short pattern, because you can have something going and then it's so easy to switch octaves and you get different results, right? So it's about having access to a different workflow. And then similarly let me back up. So this is editing for monophonic parts. I'll also briefly talk about chord parts, and then Steve will handle drums. What else is there to note? Obviously, octaves, and you can page through for longer sequences. So if I set this to be 16 steps long, and page over, now I can edit the second page. So a little less convenient, I think, than the vector, because you don't have the step numbers to tell you where you are, but still useful. Particularly, an interesting trick is to have a 16-step sequence and then just edit one half of it. Okay, so that is editing for. Yes, sir.
I have a quick question on the mono versus, and maybe you're going to move into the chord mode editing. Is that going to be covered? We just have a question about, does this work with chord mode edits as well?
It does. So let me demonstrate that.
Real quick before you jump into that, I just have one quick question about the octave. So when you set your octave at the control level, is it relative on that octave sheet there? Like, okay, I'm 3 octaves up or whatever I set there. Is that gonna, when you're moving your octaves up and up, or is that kind of set already?
It's fixed. So basically lowest to highest octave, and then it's just basically which octave you're editing at, and
so it's set within your part or your global setting. So if you're in D minor, then the lowest row will be a D. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, that's for the semitone name. So if I go and say I'm in D minor and I start with a blank sequence on the correct part, and I enter the lowest note, I get Ds. And then if I start entering notes above, E's, right? So it's limited to the notes in the scale. So that's how we're able to fit, a full octave of notes in 7 rows. And then this octave change here doesn't have anything to do with this octave setting here.
Okay.
This transposes what's being played. This changes where you're going to be editing. So if I start with a row of Ds, and then I change the octave and I go up an octave, and I'm going to push this button, and so on the vector it's D5, which is basically kind of close to middle C, and when I'm in the same octave as the notes are green. If I'm in a higher octave, the notes become red. If I'm in a lower octave, the notes are yellow. So I can keep track of where I'm editing versus where the notes in the sequence are. And then if I go to a higher octave and I hit one of these buttons, it will reprogram it to the higher octave. Right, so now they're all in the higher octave, or I go down and reprogram them down.
Okay, that makes more sense.
Yeah.
And it's super handy for anybody that's following along with the manual. If you reference page 21 and 22, there's loads and loads of Launchpad session and key tricks in there. So you can kind of follow along with what Jim and others are working on if you're interested. It's handy for me because like I need to know where I can find this information easier later, and it's all there.
Yeah, yeah. The manual descriptions are pretty concise, and I think between kind of watching what we're doing and following along here, it's and goofing around, noodling around.
That's also true.
Okay.
Sorry, one more thing. Sorry.
Sure.
So I noticed that when you had a sequence that was longer than 8 steps,
Mm-hmm.
you had to switch over with your page, and I'm pretty sure there's a follow feature on the vector itself. Is there a follow feature also with the Launchpad?
I don't think that is turned on yet. So just to fill people in globals, and I'm using Coder 9 to dial down to the third of 6 pages. Follow is the 4th parameter, and let's see. Let's set my sequence to be 16 steps, and I'm going to clear out the sequence and just put a couple notes on each page, and turn follow on.
Hey Jim, maybe alternate those up. Put your second page steps on like a 3 and a 7 or something, so we can see the page change.
So the vector display will follow. The Launchpad display doesn't follow yet. So if someone wants to shoot me an email or something, I'll get that on the list.
Yeah, I think that's what folks are asking about. It's wonderful that we can see what's happening on the vector, and if we can get the Launchpad to follow, maybe it's like an attached feature to the follow on vector that it'll by default follow on the Launchpad or something.
Yeah,
but yeah, we'll get it in a list.
Yeah, I mean follow is pretty useful, but I don't like have it on all the time. Because particularly if you're running in 16th notes, it quickly flips between them. So if you're trying to edit the sequence, that can be a problem. There is a useful little shortcut. You hold down the Q button, and you press encoder 9, and that will turn follow on and off. Follow is most useful when you have 32 or 64 step sequences, particularly if they're slower, because otherwise you can spend a fair bit of time trying to find out where it's currently playing.
Yeah, I find it super handy in lots of applications, and like you said, sometimes I turn it off just to not be affected by it. But yeah, super handy features.
Okay. All right. So next up is chords. So I'm going to go to part 5, and in globals there are 3 main pages. So the first page are basically preferences, and I hit the next button to page over to parts, which are the part settings, and I'm going to dial down to part 5, and any of the last 4 parts, 5, 6, 7, 8, can be formatted either as chord or drum parts. I'm going to reformat this one as a chord part. Follow the prompt, hit shift and clear to make sure I'm going to do this, because this will erase anything that was in that part. It will clear out all the presets. It reformats the presets to hold chords. And then I'm going to slow this down, and I'm going to make it a shorter sequence just so it's easy to figure out what's going on. I'm going to turn the gates on, kind of legato. I don't have a polyphonic synth connected, so we'll just do this by visually. I can dial in some chords. First I dial in the bass note, then I'm using encoder 9 to flip this little gray box I call the cursor over to the right hand side, and then I can start dialing in chord values, and I'm just going to stick some 7th chords in here. So I'll start with a major 7th there, and we'll go with minor 7, and
do you want to switch one to a custom chord mode just to show the 4 voices? I can do that.
I don't want to
get a bit if you like.
Yeah, well, so I've got them set up using kind of the built-in chords.
Yeah,
and then I can hold the edit button and push an encoder to flip it to custom. And now I'm editing the individual parts as semitones. and I can do that for all of them by pressing encoder 9 and getting that one back. And this is actually will be useful because now I want to, on the Launchpad, hit the user button again to go back to my navigation page. And the fifth part is the fifth column, so I'm going to push this green button. Also, I should note here, these colors match the colors of the part, the background part. So part 5, the default background is green, and that is green on the Launchpad. And that holds for this page and the top row of the session. All right, so edit this, and it's nominally the same as editing a monophonic sequence, but you can only edit one voice at a time. And there are 4 voices for chords. The lowest voice is what I call the bass note, which is also the bass note, D, F, C, E, and that's D, E, F, and then C, and then E. And I can re-edit these to choose different bass notes for the chords. Looks like I'm also changing the octave a bit. Let me move these up an octave. Now these kind of pink colored pads, they're I guess pale lavender on the video. These are all the other notes in the chords, and they're mapped as they would be as if they were their own monophonic sequences. And then the 4 lower buttons on the right hand side of the Launchpad are for choosing which voice you're going to edit. So the lowest note is the bass note, and if I go one step up, I have a new set of lights, and these are for the next note up. So for the first chord, the bass note is D, and that was this note here because we're, I think, still in D minor. And then if I go to edit the second voice, that will be the lowest of the column of semitones, and that is 3 semitones up from D, which will be a minor third, and that is here. And then I can push this up to the 4th, and down to 3, so it gets quantized into the scale, so I can't do a major third in D minor.
That's super rad though, because when you get into the editing and you're looking at the vector screen and you've got a lot of data there, for me it's easier to digest the theory behind the chord when I see it on the grid in the Launchpad. Not coming from a music theory background, it helps me digest the intervals between the notes a little easier if I'm going to stay inside of the standard intervals.
Yeah, and you know, it's a deep thing, music theory, right? Even if you're just working with chords that are typically used in pop songs, and this is an interesting way to kind of improvise chords, right? So you can, you know, go up to the session page. These are my mutes for part 5. I can mute, I'm sorry, those are all the part mutes. These are the mutes for part 5. So I can mute all but the bass note, and then go back over here, and I can edit these on the Launchpad and kind of set up the overall contour of what I'm doing, and then go back to session and say unmute the top one, which would be the soprano, and edit that voice independently, right?
Wow.
And then I'm sorry, I'm still editing the second one. Edit the top voice, right? I can even pop them up by octaves.
I wanted to insert real quick, as we're talking about being able to manipulate notes of the chord effectively before hearing them, and then you go back to your session page on the Launchpad after you've manipulated the chord, and then you unmute the portion of the chord that you want to hear that you just edited. I feel like there have been a decent amount of chatter from folks with this kind of feature, and this seems like a nice way to achieve that, to be able to queue up another portion of the same sequence and then just mute a note and unmute a note, and now you've got the edited portion of that sequence. So forgive me for thinking about this outside of chord mode. I was imagining using chord mode in a monophonic setting and just turning the notes of the chord on or off based on the portion of the monophonic setting that I was editing. And that's
a cool idea.
Yeah, it just kind of came to me as you were talking that out, based on what some of the feature requests from other users have been. Effectively, you could have 4 sequences running as long as they weren't competing note data to your monophonic synth, and just unmute one of those notes at a time. It just seems like an interesting feature or workaround to achieve that function that's been kind of a popular request.
Yeah, yeah, and and you can. I don't want to get too deep into the routing, but you can route each voice independently on the analog outputs, and you can also mirror it on MIDI. And so you could have an analog output, say, going to a Moog bass that duplicates the bass note of the scale, say an octave below, and then route the other notes to a MIDI polyphonic synthesizer, and be able to combine those two sounds from one sequence.
That's just brilliant.
Yeah, yeah. So those are the basics for chord editing. Again, it takes a little fiddling around on the Launchpad to kind of appreciate this approach. It's a little bit of a different approach. Of course, you can always flip back to the vector and see how it looks on there. And then next up, I'll transition over to Steve actually I'll go ahead and format a part. I'll go for part 8. I'm going to format it as drums, just to show how you do that. Hold down the part button and select part 8. And this is what a drum sequence looks like. And then I'm going to hand this off to Steve, who's going to show us how to edit drums on the Launchpad.
I like drums. Here we go. Drums are good. All right, so alrighty, okay. You should be able to see my vector, and you should be able to see the Launchpad. So just going back to some things we were talking about earlier briefly, I'm going to use parts 7 and 8 as my drum parts today, and I should be on the screen. I'm on the screen, yes. And I'm just making sure that when I go back to my drum parts, because remember we had these mute and unmute buttons divided into quadrants, parts 7.1, 2, 3, 4, 8.1, 2, 3, 4, they're unmuted, so I'm just double checking that, and I'm double checking that my parts overall are unmuted as well, so that I'm ready to go. Now going to my preset page, I've got some parts already playing, so I'll just hit run over here on the vector with my... Right? So I can go back in and go mute, unmute, all of that, right? But I'm going to select 2 blank presets now. Okay, nothing's happening because there's nothing in those presets. So I go back to my edit screen, so the 4th button on the top row here, and I can select all of my parts, or one at a time obviously. I'm going to select part 7 first, and you can see the blue cursors moving along dutifully, showing the cursor position for the step for each of the 4 drum voices. I'm going to be manipulating 8 drum voices today, which means I'm consuming 2 vector parts, because a vector drum part can use 4 drum voices per part. Now, the way that operates on this particular screen, I have the length of my step at the moment for this part being drum part 1, part 7 on my vector as 8. Now, if I hold shift and dial that one to the right, it becomes 16, and you can immediately see that blue cursor started to travel from 1 to 8, then 9 to 16, showing that I'm using a 16 step part. Now, I don't have to use 16, I could use 10. And you'll see that the Launchpad starts only then consuming 10 of the 16 steps. So I'm going to dial that back to 8. It's really easy. You just shift and dial. And I'm going to start populating this drum beat with some stuff. The drum sounds are all routed via my Rossum assimilator. Yeah. So there's a kick I made from a BIA. And this should be a garden variety snare, clap, and some sampled Crucible. Crucible's a great module, by the way, if anyone here is listening. It's a really great module. Anyway, so what I'm going to do now that I've got an 8-step pattern is I'm going to go back over to my vector, and I'm going to hit shift and double. Sorry, I'm in the wrong screen for that. I have to go to the pitch screen, and you can see that as I'm enabling and disabling the snare over here on the Launchpad, that it's appearing on step 5 and disappearing. So now if I hit shift and double, and you've got to be in the pitch or the gate screens for that doubling function to work, immediately on the Launchpad screen page, you can see that it's populated all those hits. Why would I just double something though, if it's going to be exactly the same? Well, generally I wouldn't. I'd then just start playing around with the hi-hats and doing things like this, just alternate patterns across the... And what I've got there is a whole range of Crucible samples that I took into my simulator, and I've got it selecting various samples from the Crucible. I still keep the Crucible in the rack because it's heavily modulatable, but when I'm just playing beats like this, I just use samples. So what I can do here is... just really, I love just sitting here doing this with drum beats, and especially when I'm recording into Cubase and whatever, I'll often just play with beats in real time and then just chop up the sections I really like or remove the ones I don't like. Now, you can expand this to 32 steps, obviously, or 64 depending on your part configuration, but as we were discussing with Nick earlier, basically you'll have to move screens to view those like this, using those arrows there. So there you go. So that's one drum part. Let's have a look at the second drum part, and I'm just making this up as I go quite clearly. Now I've only got one kick on part 7. I'm in part 8 now. I'm just going to add in a... And I've only got 8 steps selected there, so I'm going to go back over to... I'm going to go to part, select part 8, control, and I'm going to say 16. So I've got an alternate kick there, which is almost functioning like a low tom in context, which I think is kind of fun. If I was actually turning this into a proper beat, I'd probably modulate that pitch so that kick sound moved around a bit, but we're not going to do that right now.
So Steve, I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on how you typically split your drum parts between vector parts. Or split your drum sounds.
That's a really great question. So, it's funny, once you get into Modular, you've got so many different sound targets you can point things to, and it becomes busy really quickly. I find that most effectively, I'll use drum part 7, usually 4 voices for your fundamentals. So, kick, snare, hi-hat, and a clap or a rim shot, or something that you can offset with the snare to create a bit of movement. And the majority of the heavy lifting of the beat will be done in that drum part 7. In drum part 8, I will often use different sample sounds like a scratched vinyl sound, or I've even got crumbled up leaf sounds that I recorded with a Zoom recorded, little Zoom handheld thing, and crunched up leaves make a great noise kind of source, if you know what I mean. And I use all sorts of little coin sounds or different things as found sound type things to mix in with the drums. So I use those quite sparingly though, or often I'll just take a whole lot more hi-hat samples for variation and put them in an alternate drum part. I think you can definitely overlayer things by using too many sounds, so you've got to be a bit careful there. But also, once I've got stuff in the assimilator and being triggered by the vector, I can then use the pitch outputs from the vector to then modulate the pitch input or the pitch control of, say, a tom sound or whatever, or even quantize that using an LFO. So, yeah, is that what you're asking?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's similar. I don't program drums nearly as much as you do, but when I'm using 2 drum parts, I'd follow the same strategy. As one is your basic beat, and then the secondary one are kind of the filigree, right? And it can seem like a limitation at first that you only have 4 lanes in a part for drums, but splitting.
I would dispute that. Yeah. And
Same.
the reason I would the reason I would dispute it, and some people see things differently, obviously, but the way I would work is this: I would have those 2 different drum environments or drum parts, being able to mute one with one click of a button and then unmute it is just really, really useful to me. So I've got 2 parts here. Right, I mean, you've just done something, you can control, but being able to divide them into 2 different lanes, as I would think of them in my head, or parts, is really useful in that way. Plus, also, I can modulate one of them really heavily and keep the other one stable. And that way, you've got a little bit of an anchor for the listener, because you're not going nuts on all of the drum sounds at once, which of course you can. But yeah, I just like being able to split it into 2 different hemispheres, I guess, in my head.
Yeah, it's a nice way to work.
But I'm not disputing that other people might find it valuable to be able to do 8 in 1. I just guess I like it like this too.
Well, and to the point of if you got a sampler that has 16 inputs on it, like a Korg Electribe or something to that effect, you could effectively program part 5 to be drum or sample 1 to 4, part 6 sample 5 to 8, and
Yeah.
so on down the line to get 16 sample channels from one sampler utilizing the MIDI spread. So
Yeah.
but I support what you're doing here too. I too also like to have multiple environments and lots of control, and similarly, I do my hats on 8 and my drums on 7. It's just nice to have the variations and being able to mute individual voices.
I also like doing things like take the extra found sound stuff and flip the direction of them occasionally, but keep the other one going forwards. It's just nice to be able to do that really easily. So
Yeah, that's
So
wonderful.
I've messed around. I have the micro bitbox, and
Yep.
it pairs really well with
Yes.
the 8 cells and the 8 different channels. And yeah, you can use definitely one channel for the your basic small drum kit, and then the other for you can either keep going with drums, or you can have those be clips or loops
Yeah.
or samples or whatever. I mean, I think one thing that I was really having fun with was I didn't have a lot of the drum samples when I got the bitbox, but I had like a lot of, like you said, the found sounds and loops. I was using the drum system just to like do generative like phase looping stuff. You know?
Yeah.
So it's fun
Yeah.
but I like the way you've set it up.
Yeah, thanks. It's just something I had a lot of fun with. The other thing I love doing too is this, when I've got those 2 different zones of drums or 2 different parts. So I'm in part 8 here, which is the extras part. I mean, you can do things like...
Yeah, nice, easy tricks.
And you'll find you'll get little length variations. This isn't the most interesting beat to do this with. I would have prepared something that had a lot more action in it on that second lot. But you can certainly muck around with the length and the direction to actually just keep changing the way those 2 beats.
Steve, while you're
So-
doing that, do me a favor and just dial that length down to like 1 or 3.
Oh, yeah, good fun, yeah. Except it's not the most interesting beat to do that with. So what I'm going to do
But
is...
you see the point there.
It was
Yeah.
a great idea you had until I ruined it. Yeah, but what it would have done is it would have sat on that front note and just given you a nice little fill or something. But yeah, so here's one I didn't prepare earlier, as they say. So yeah, I guess that's me for drums. But I mean, I'm going to touch a little bit on modulation and talk about drums later on too. So yeah, that's another thing I absolutely love doing.
Will you be talking a little bit about chants and the chants?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
then I won't
absolutely.
say anything.
No, go for it. But we can talk about it later, I guess. But,
A little bit more on the point of, like how it's basically 4 parts of mono synth on the front half of the vector and 4 parts of poly or chord mode, effectively for parts 5, 6, 7, and 8. It's quite nice the way it's set up for me, and I think some other folks, typically the way I see Steve's setup is we tend to gravitate towards the same 4 monos on the front and 4 polys on the back, and drums tend to gravitate towards 7 and 8. Dare I use the word standard, or in the Euro rack land? I know it's a naughty word in modular
There are no
world.
standards in Euro rack.
But coming from like the engineering world, where on a console kick is channel 1 and snare is channel 2 and so on up the line, for me and my system, and what I see in a lot of vector based systems, is most folks tend to have some voices kind of allocated to parts on the vector. And where I would lead with this is, if other folks have vectors with similar patchings, then you could share projects with each other if you know your voices are going to kind of line up similarly, as monos on 1 to 4 and polys on 5 to 8. You can hand that off via email and give that to someone, and it might do something cool.
You're trying to create order out of chaos, and I love it.
You crazy fool.
It could be kind of an interesting thing is to have, say, Steve and Cody come up with some drum patterns, and I could add some monophonic patterns, and then send it out to people, and hook it up to their system, whatever it is, and just see what it sounds like. Just
Yeah.
just kind of almost a random compositional trick, right?
It's like the
Well-
traveling pants kind of situation, right? Like this,
Yeah. Well, and I can attest to my own experience with the Vector. Coming into it, I didn't know exactly how to approach it, and it took me a little while to wrap my brain around the approach of the way Vector handles the sequencing, and it became intuitive and second nature. But if I had a session that I could have loaded and just hit play and it did some stuff right out the box, that would have been beneficial for a person like me to reverse engineer. Oh, this is why they did those things. And at that time, we didn't have the beauty of the deep dive and access to so much knowledge about the Vector. But it would, similar to Ableton Live, getting a demo session. When you start the software, you just hit play, and now you can navigate and look at stuff. And that's where my brain was going with that suggestion is, if Steve and I came up with a suggested format for how you could route your parts and share that session, then maybe that would be helpful for other folks as well.
It's an interesting idea.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, so let's press on with demos. I'm going to give a walkthrough on record modes, and then we'll have another musical interlude. So let me. Okay, so this time I'm actually going to do it. I'm going to turn on the spotlight before I stand up.
Woohoo!
Yep. New, and try not to knock things over with the headphone cable. All right, so let me get back to a starting point. And the record page is the first red button. It's actually the only red button. And there are quite a few changes in this page from 1.0. In fact, this is probably the part on the Vector that changed the most. And the idea is to have several different modes where you're basically taking some MIDI input and you're doing something to the sequence. And I'm sure people will be asking about arpeggiator modes, and those will be coming, and they will appear here. So the idea isn't just that this is for recording patterns, but this is for anything you might do to manipulate a pattern via MIDI. So I'm going to start with the first mode, which is step, for step recording. And actually before that, I should mention this parameter, the record parameter. And this is now global, so it means that you can have master record on for all parts at the same time, and then within each part you have a different mode that's available, and it can be off or it can be step. And if you watch the Launchpad over on my left, you can see that the colors are changing as I change different modes. So blue for off, red for step, and orange for step through, trans is purple, and through is full orange. And then on the Launchpad as well, master record is the second button down on the right hand side column. And so this is again another handy way for having a Launchpad around, particularly for a complex project, is you can very easily turn record on and off. And in fact, I can have record initiated for several parts and use this to flip it on and off for everybody. So back to part one, I'm going to set the mode to step. My sequence is currently empty, but I'm going to go ahead and add some gate values. And on the record page, when you're in step mode, the right hand side shows you the active steps for the sequence, just 8 right now, and what the note names are for those. And I can set the source to the Vector keyboard, the onboard keyboard. It could be coming in USB-B, maybe from the computer, Ableton, etc. USB-A is whatever's plugged in here, which can be any MIDI keyboard that has USB. In this case, it's the Launchpad. And if I hit the keys button on the Mini, which would be whatever the third button is on the other Launchpads, we have a keyboard here. And I know people will ask, there are other keyboard layouts coming. And also it's a little washed out on my screen, but the white keys are white and the black keys are kind of purple. And also you could have the jack expander MIDI input as another source. So I'll start with the Vector keyboard. We'll change that just to avoid confusion, and I can just plug in the notes however I see fit. They will be quantized, so if I keep hitting A flat, I'm not going to get an A flat because I'm still in another key. and I can also use encoder 9 to cursor around, and if I don't like what I'm doing, I can hit Shift clear to clear it out, but I need to add my gate values back in. And I can cursor around and individually enter notes that way, which is a useful way to work. Similarly, I could be using the Launchpad or something else plugged into USB-A, and then I can enter notes that way. And then, of course, I can start the sequence after queuing up the audio, and mute that part for now. Okay, so that is one way to enter sequences. The next mode up is ST plus T, which is step plus through. And the difference here, it's still step record, but every time you play a note, it will sound it out through the vector. And again, I can still use encoder 9 to flip between. I can quickly zero things out that way, go through, edit them individually, and then play the sequence. One other useful trick to know, if you're not using the vector keyboard for step, actually for all the modes, let's say I'm using USB-A, and I go to the pitch page, I can see a little underline here. This is called the cursor, and it shows you where the vector is going to step record, and I can hold down Shift in encoder 9 to change that. And actually, I've already made a note. I'm going to change it to be Q in encoder 9, which I know is a lot of key combinations, but anyway, I'm thinking out loud. All right, so I can step record from the Launchpad on the pitch page, and indeed I could be on another part entirely, and that still works. That's the kind of the beauty and the danger of having record latch and always be on. And again, also handy to have the Launchpad available so you know what's going on in terms of record modes. Okay,
just
next
highlighting
mode.
that. Sorry, just highlighting that,
Yeah.
Jim. When you said that on the session page there, you can see that he's manipulating part 1, and in the second row there, that part 1, the first pad is lit up to show that it is in rec mode and that it will be affected by stuff you do. So just keep that in mind when you're working on it. Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to highlight that bit.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And and if I use the Launchpad to do that, it'll turn it off. Master record stays on. The mode for part 1 goes off, but if I push it again, it'll remember that it was in transpose mode and go right back to that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. When I started playing around with it initially in the betas, it threw me a couple of times because I was getting rec mode and thinking, hang on, why am I hearing all this big sound? And I realized I'm actually playing through to multiple different output devices, and then I thought, oh, that's cool.
Yeah, it's a really useful feature, but it does take a little getting used to if you're not used to it. All right, next up is through mode. Oh wait, no, we're in transpose mode. I jumped ahead by 1. So I have a sequence running here, and transpose is on. I'm still in USB-A, which is the vector. I can go over here, and now I can start transposing. And really what this is doing is setting the semitone transpose value here. But now I don't have to be on the sequence control page. I can be anywhere.
So go back to the control page and show us that number changing, please, while you're transposing. Yeah. So hit play. Yep.
It is not updating, so that's a bug.
Oh, there you go. Sorry, Jim.
Watching bugs live.
Who invited me?
This is the unseen benefit. Is any weird little bugs like that will definitely pop up. So Steve, since you brought it up, can you shoot me an email?
Yes, I can do that. Yeah.
The least he could do.
Yeah, and Jim, real quick before we move on past transpose, you can allocate transpose to all parts at once or individual parts. Is that right?
Yes, you can. So,
like if you have your whole sequence running and you want to transpose everything together, then turn it on for each part, right?
That's great.
yes.
Perfect.
So you can see as I flip through the part page, 3 and 4 I've turned on to transpose. They're now available. I don't have them mapped in a way that's useful, but you
That's
would be able to
helpful.
transpose them. Yeah. And I mean, just looking further down the line, one of the things I really like to have is the concept of zones, so that in addition to the source, you could set a zone, or actually it would be a zone would be part of the source. So I could have, 4 1-octave zones on the Launchpad, or maybe a 2-octave zone and 2 1-octave zones. And then you'd be able to assign them to different parts. So you could say have parts 1 and 2 transpose on the bottom 2 octaves. Part 3 could be through. Part 4 could be transpose up here. There are a lot
That's lovely.
Yeah, a lot of interesting options there. So in a way, what you're seeing here is useful stuff as it is, but it's also creating placeholders for other things we want to add later.
So real quickly, so that point about being able to transpose multiple things at once is great, because obviously transposing your bass and your melody would be really nice to do. Is it true or is it not true? You can't do that though if you don't have this Launchpad, or is there a way to set that up without the Launchpad to be able to transpose multiple things?
Yeah, you can do it from any source. So it's just easier to see what the assignments are on the Launchpad. But if I say I have a Korg Prologue under the shelf, I could plug that into Jack Expander MIDI in or some other keyboard on USB, and it's a little more work because you are using this hold the part key and press the white buttons to jump parts, and set them up individually, but it will still work. It doesn't have to be on the Launchpad.
Cool.
But you could now, with the record button on the Vector, will that turn on each part individually, or is that all parts on and off?
So this button is the master record on and off.
Oh,
so
perfect.
That's everybody, and the individual buttons are per part.
Great. So if you have your 4 monophonic voices that you want to transpose for just a temporary moment, a live improv or creating a new preset, you select the 4 that you want to manipulate, or 3 or 8, and when you're done with that, you can hit that master record button on the Launchpad and go back to your regular performance mode.
Yeah.
That's just wonderful.
Yeah.
Someone asked about the transposition, if it respects the global key or not.
Yes. So the global key is D minor here, and just to follow that through, on each part in the sequence control pages, on page 2, sequence control 2, you can see they're grayed out because it's the default D minor. I could overwrite it here, but it affects what I can dial in for notes. So I can't get a B, I get a B flat. And any sort of semitone transposition, external transposition, step recording, what the Vector does internally is when it's writing the note, it will quantize it, and when it's reading it out, it will quantize again. So it will read out, say, an A, and if there's a 1, say we'll say a 2 semitone transposition coming in, it will calculate a B internally and then quantize it to the scale and make it B flat again. So the idea is when you have key and scale set, you can't get outside the scale.
And let me insert a little chaos in here. With the global scale, is that an always or a choosable option to have the global scale or to not have the global scale?
Well, you can set it to chromatic, and then you can play any note.
There you go.
And and another kind of personal wish of mine, because it's actually very useful to occasionally have an accidental, is to have some way where you can specify a step, say, I don't know, edit and twist or some combination to mark a step as being unquantized.
You can also have on a per preset. You can have a per preset key and scale as well, which will override the global one for that particular preset.
In sequence
part,
control.
or preset. Yeah. That's
so in sequence control, page 2, I could say it's D major for a section or chromatic, well,
it's great to bring that point up, Steve, because in the current configuration of Vector, if you have a project that contains 2 songs or a song that goes from one key structure to another key structure, you can have your master key be inputted, and whenever you want to switch to your next song, that's your key change data is contained inside the presets.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good one too.
Yeah. Okay, so let's see. Next up we have through, and I'm just to avoid any surprises. So through basically, and we'll start with the vector. I think this is the mode that David was using in his gig the other night. Now I can use this keyboard to play notes directly. And I'm not following my quantize rule there. Steve, send me a bug report.
Yeah, that's I'm already writing it, mate. I've got a big.
But this is a really handy way to do a little improv in the middle of a set. In particular, like I like to be able to play on the Launchpad and then ride filter cutoff on the modular. Very handy. And then another thing to note is if the sequence is playing and you have through mode on, the notes you play will override the sequence. So okay. And again, you can have through on multiple parts at once. That could get a little chaotic, but could be useful. All right, last up is real-time grid. This is very new with 2.0. So to help with that, I have set up, let me clear out part 1, clear. I'm going to look at part 2, and I'd been messing around with that in another demo, so I just have kind of a percussion sound, and I'm going to put a little accent on beat 1. So this is to give me some sort of a tempo reference as I'm improvising on the keyboard, because the way real-time grid works, just let me on USB A, is that as the sequence plays, at the beginning of a step, the vector will say, is a note being held down? Yes. Okay, program that step. If it gets to the second step, is the note still down? It'll tie into there. Or is it a different note? It'll program that note. So things are quantized and tied to the grid, but you can enter the notes live. And
Oh, that's a brilliant feature. It's
Hang
so
on a sec.
Yep.
Yeah, sorry. I'm just. You've got ties working as step input now. Right.
yeah.
That's another thing I didn't know. Okay, cool. Wow.
Well,
That's
and like,
awesome.
yeah, like, you know, not to reference another sequencer, but similar to beat step or key step, this is a feature, you know, that has crossed over from other styles of sequencing. It's nice to see the live input, essentially, as your sequence is looping. It's carrying the note over, and it feels like you just played it into it. So that's wonderful to be able to hear back effectively what you played as a sequence into it. And I think Travarsi brought up a good question too. Using the vector keyboard, the buttons on the vector keyboard, you don't have to have the sequence running to have that output the data. So if you're auditioning notes with your sequence not running, the vector can effectively become its own MIDI controller for that voice, right?
Well, let's see. Steve started an email, but no, it does not do through.
Oh, okay. So it does need to be running.
But it's easy to back up to through, and hang on a second. What did I do? Right. I was pushing the wrong keyboard. It's easy to dial back to through.
Yeah, so that's the feature I think
it does work.
Yeah, that's the feature I think she was asking about, was being able to just play it as a keyboard, if you will. And it seems like you can. That's great.
So just to back up a second, so to do the tied note, it's just literally holding it down through that next step, and
Yeah,
it'll tie
yeah.
it. Cool.
Yeah, and this is one case where using long sequences, particularly if you want to, if you want to generate a long melody, and you want to, you know, have a little bit of a human feel to it, you can set as 32nd or 64th notes, and then have a 64-step grid, and that gives you a wider palette to work on, a wider canvas to work on.
So with that mentality, you wouldn't have to call that step. Well, let me back up how to word this. When you format your part to be a 16 or a 32 or a 64 step sequence, if you're in a 32 step sequence and you want more resolution, then you can scale back on your control page to be a separate resolution. Yeah, to change the rate effectively will give you more spaces. So if I get to a spot in my sequence and it's like, oh, dang, I've been running 32 steps for everything and now I need 64, then I can just change the rate of that, of the part sequence resolution for that preset and kind of fake a 64-step sequence length without having to reformat and lose all the data on the part. That seems like a nice way to approach that.
Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of details in terms of, if you're how you want to record, what sort of thing you're trying to record in, and adjusting the length of the sequence and the rate, the maximum length of the sequence and the rate, and also, there are other settings in here you can mess with, but I'm just working with 8-step short sequences and really at a fairly fast tempo for programming 16th notes. But I know people who prefer to work with, they're doing ambient work, right? And it's almost like an ambient loop. So, you set it to a 32-step sequence, set the rate down to, say, a quarter note or even slower, and then slowly interlines. And it's a common ambient trick to do this across 2 or 3 parts that are different lengths and just let them play against each other.
Well, and the reason I bring that up is when you're creating your parts for your project and creating the format for the parts and the sequence length, in order to not lose or reformat the part and lose the work that you put in, oftentimes I think in advance, well, my drums are typically going to land in 16 steps, but occasionally I'll want a longer pattern, or you utilize the playlist to alternate between presets. So there's so many ways to kind of create this individual feel of an instrument, but it's also noted that when you make every sequence or every part 64 steps, then you're limited more so than to the amount of presets that you can create for each of those parts. So I find myself kind of between 16 and 32, and occasionally on like my poly stuff I'll end up in 64, but utilizing the resolutions here, or the rates rather, of the sequence is a great way to have more presets available to you if you don't actually need 64 steps, and it can be achieved by utilizing the rate instead of allocating steps. It's kind of a nice way to utilize the memory of the vector a bit more efficiently, I think, is what I'm trying to explain. So when when everything's set for very long sequences, then you have less presets. So this is a nice way to end up with lots of presets by adjusting the length of the steps.
Well, there's an easy fix to that, and that's you just buy another vector.
Very easy fix to that.
Easy.
Hey, sorry guys, that is a great suggestion. Everyone should buy another vector, but no, I don't have shares in 512. Jim, a question came through, and it was that from Mr. X. Does real-time grid work on drum and chords too? Now, I know that real-time grid works on drums.
It does not work on chords.
But it does not work on chords, was my recollection. Also, I can't play chords fast enough to do that. So, but
it's on the list, and it's not a big thing to add, but scope control is critical to making software releases.
But it absolutely, definitely does for drums. What you would do is you'd set up generally your MIDI input with whatever notes are configured for that drum part, and you just tap them in as you would expect. It's really good fun. I play little games from time to time because I I got no life, where I just set up the clock and then I sort of say, right, I'm going to put the hi-hat on the 7, and then I just, just practice timing it out, and that's really good fun. So, yeah. Anyway,
Yeah,
that's an
yeah.
insight into my life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a cry for help.
Beyond that. Acceptance.
So I'm going to do another quick musical interlude from the Sine Mountain set. Let me...
I just want to just add a few things before you play this, because again, like in preparation for this talk, I was spending way more time in the skiff mode, as I mentioned earlier. So when I did this performance on Off the Grid, it was really fun to kind of play a lot with chants, a lot of the chants modes. I use a lot because obviously, like, there's a lot of space and a lot of things I wanted to do with the pedals. So when you're watching me play with the pedals, I spent a lot of time on the chances, so there would be enough modulation changes and stuff like that going on with the textures on the Dust of Time. So
excellent. And tell me what the Dust of Time does.
The Dust of Time is by Neutron Sound, and that is just a really crazy, awesome oscillator that's kind of on the Ornaments and Crime level of deepness. It has VCAs and internal VCAs and modulation inside, so it's really pairs well with like a vector because it can just kind of sit next to it and not need a lot of other
it's
things.
kind of its own voice.
Its own voice, and you can use all the other. It actually has a MIDI input as well, so if you want to play around velocity and stuff like that. But what I also was messing around with using the the second set of gates outs to sometimes fire off other modulation inside of it. So it's just a ton of fun.
Excellent. So here we go. Let's see if I can get screen share going the first time around. Share sound.
Tasha, did you know Geico could save you hundreds on car insurance and a whole lot more? So what are you waiting for? Hip-hop group tag team to help you plan dessert?
Oh, I love that.
Oh, man.
Perfect. It's art.
It's that new Sine Mountain. You said you used to make hip-hop music.
I'm sponsored by Geico.
And,
your production values have really improved.
I wanted to really say something about commerce and art.
Wow. 512 was brought to you by, I think that was Geico. So there you go.
Yeah, I'll flip back to the share after the 3 commercials have played through.
Wow, yeah.
It's what you all didn't know you needed.
That was almost as good as me muting all during a live performance last week, and including the performer. So that was good. Anyway, sorry, back to regular viewing now.
Yeah. So note to self is to this was kind of a last minute thing to decide to put this in, and
well, yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Yeah, we were just talking about music and latest stuff, and so shout out to New York Modular Society. They're doing a good show. Check out that show. So do the sponsorship so you don't have to watch the ads.
Yeah, it's on Twitch. New York Modular Society, right?
Yeah, they do a lot of awesome shows too. So definitely check that out. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, it's a lovely piece. I
Very
listened to the
nice.
whole thing this morning, and I think I'll be listening to it again tonight.
Yeah. Thanks. Appreciate that. Yeah, that was definitely. It's been a while since I played live, and that felt good. And not to. I know I'm on the Vector show, so I'm kind of like touting it, but like it really does help to do things not only on the grid but off the grid. Your last, I think maybe it was 2 deep dives ago, you were showing all your different kind of phase things you can do with phases and stuff, and that really really made me rethink about like how to approach any sequencer really, but definitely like the Vector on like how you can use it in those different play with different time signatures, and doesn't even though it's really great at doing stuff to make like house music or something like that, you could do really generative stuff, and with all the sub-modulation options you have in there and all the chant stuff, it's like having a second partner who's doesn't have his head on straight, so it's great.
I think that's a great way to describe it. I see it that way too, is that it talks back to you, right? You can ask it questions and it will answer them for you, and you're not always on the hook yourself to figure out what to do next.
Really lovely module, and I'm so glad to see the 2.0. It's been really fun this whole journey that you've taken us all on with the Vector. I think it's been fun from the get-go. I loved it with the very first firmware, and these new additions has just been really amazing. So from me and everybody else who's probably in chat, thank you, Jim. This is an awesome module.
Excellent. Thanks a lot. Lovely to hear that. And I know you have to run pretty soon, so it was great to have you in. Join us. Like, lots of great questions and feedback, and some lovely music. It's really nice.
Yeah, thanks so much. I gotta bounce. I promised the kid that we go to the bird store, so we gotta. My other passion is birding, so we gotta. It's a lovely day, so we gotta do our thing. But
absolutely.
Thanks everybody.
All right.
Sounds as cool
Take
as
care.
going to the synth shop.
Almost. I mean, it's like it's like little oscillators in the trees.
Yeah.
Very good.
Cool, man. Thanks, David.
Thank you, David.
All right.
Okay.
Take care, Guy. We'll see you online.
All right, peace out, everyone.
All right. So, Steve, you're up next. Are you ready for
Yep.
your last demo? This is kind of a demo binge.
Are we doing the chance operators one? Sorry, the modulation one?
Whichever you like. Really, I mean, I've got to go through the list. Let me get back into grid mode here real quick.
Because there was the real-time chord one, which I think you kind of demonstrated chords well enough anyway. I don't think, it's up to you, but I think that the modulation input one's a good one.
Yeah, I'd say show modulation input, and because there are several new modulation targets that are available in 2.0.
Yeah.
Looking through my list, we
talk
covered
about that.
copy and paste of scenes. The step length calculation, follow mode, we covered that. Several of the prefs, encoder switch mode. So there are a couple of things I'll cover right after yours, and then we'll be wrapping up our kind of marathon demo.
Yeah, it's been a big one. All right, let me just sort out my OBS, and there you go. So you can see my Launchpad and my Vector again. These are things I've sort of talked about in the past, but I'll just do a quick look at. So first up, I'm going to go and call back the presets that I want, okay, which I've done. Now, I've got a trusty maths just slightly out of view here, but what I'm going to do is go to part 7 and go to modulation, and what you can see is there are a couple of things that are happening. I've got 2 cables coming out of my maths. I'm using channels 1 and 4 on maths, and they're coming into modulation 1 and modulation 2 on the Vector. Now, it's interesting because when you choose the sources, they're not mod 1 and mod 2, they're ext1 and ext2, so external 1 and external 2, or none. They're your options, okay? So what I've got is the first target being gate, and the amount that it will interact with being 90. So I'm just going to go ahead and mute part 8, and these are some of the old standard things that have been in the Vector for a while. So I'm going to do this one, and then I'll show you some of the newer things as well. So So what I'm going to do is go up onto my maths and increase the scale of what it's able to do so it starts kicking in, and what you'll hear is some skipped beats. And the reason I do that is because if I bring in part 8 again, and parts 8, that's better. Sorry about that. I go back to my modulation source. So now what I can do is I can have part 7 skipping some hits every now and again because the gate target is being muted by the activity of maths. But my extra part, and this goes back to what you asked me before, Jim, is still continually playing, and then I can bring that back in. Now, that's creating sort of a scarcity or a lower dynamic by removing notes. If I want to do the opposite, let's go back to drum part 1. You can see on external 2, I've got ratcheting. So if I want to create more notes or more hits, I just dial up math to sort of send some stuff into that one. And that's extreme. It's not particularly musical, but... Now what if I combine that? What if I reduce hits? But have the ones that hit ratchet. That's kind of cool. Yeah, so you can see what I'm doing there is I'm using the inputs of modulation to create a scarcity of hits or to just really overdo it a little bit. And being able to sort of modulate those two things either via a free running LFO or just hand dialing it yourself, which I actually really like doing. You can create a bit more sort of dynamics in what you're doing. And generally I would record that for a little while, say for 32 bars, and then I'd just go back and think, hey, that section of 8 was really good, and I'd do something with that. So yeah, that's just a standard kind of thing that Vector's done for a little while. So what I'm going to do is mute that part and go back to part 3, which is a Tone Star 8106. Doing this. And what I'm going to do is go to part 3, and you can see that at the moment I've got source selected to none, but I've got some new targets here. So if I go back to gate, which is what I was manipulating on the drums before, if I dial to the left on the encoder that's under that, you can see that we've got velocity, W and N. What are those ones, Jim? W and N?
Those are modulating velocity, and wide and narrow are what W and N. So
right.
Will be a much wider range. Narrow will be narrow range.
Right. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Because when I was trying it, I could hear subtle... Yeah, okay, that makes sense. And you've also got the ones I really love, which are pitch modulation. And I think a lot of the people out there who talk about doing things like transposing and all of that kind of thing, here's another tool for your arsenal. So as you heard, I had a pattern there that was a pretty active one. So what I'm going to go and do is create a preset under 3, a new one, and I'm going to go back to edit, and I'm going to edit that preset and just add in just some standard pitch, and then okay, not terribly exciting. I'm going to go to external 1. I've got it as a free running LFO, and that's on gate at the moment, which we already demonstrated. Now let's flip it back to... So now I've gone from playing one note to playing intervals of a 7, perfect 7 or 12, which is going to be your 5th and your octave. Now if I reduce the amount, it's like a scaling function. So in CV land you might have something like a WMD SPO, which I use for scaling a lot, but this is scaling internally on the vector, which then says this is the range within which I'm going to allow my external modulation to affect pitch. Really good fun. Now, if I go back to transpose... Oh, that's nice. That's kind of got that bridge to chorus feel to it. You could just sort of auto-generate Depeche Mode songs if you can write lyrics.
So you could have, go into transpose mode on record and have one hand on the Launchpad and another one on the maths.
All right, so I don't want to labour this too much, but this is a function I really love. And also, you can put the amount into negative. All right, so that's good fun, I reckon. And yeah, of course, you've got the target mode for octaves. Remember, I'm generating all this just from a single note, a single pitch sequence. Ooh. I think that was throwing the tone star into some pretty strange territory. This is better. And remember, any LFO you want to plug into this, you can use to control this. I've got a Maestro Acid Rain, and I have a lot of fun doing this stuff. Brian pointed me in the direction of that. And pitch being a second here. Now let's go back to the preset that I had running originally, which is the more active one. Oops, hang on. I confused myself. Right. So you don't just have to do it with just with a single note. Remember, this is quantizing based upon the C minor scale that I'm in at the moment. So if I go back to pitch, chant modulation, yep. Now what I could do over here, because I've still got another LFO coming in on modulation too, I'm not going to do another pitch modulate. I could, but that'd be just bizarre. So now what I've got is some notes being skipped. It's not particularly musical the way I've got it set up, but you can see what I'm doing here. I'm using external modulation and those new targets there.
And the nice thing is that you're covering a wide musical range very quickly.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right.
And you know, and it's an interesting way to expand the modifications you can make on a sequence by incorporating other CV sources in your system.
Yeah, and that's going back to the conversation that Cody was having before about very long sequences or 64-step sequences. And that's the really interesting thing about talking to other people who use the same technology you do. I generally don't make long sequences. I make 16 or 32 at the most step sequences, but I use some of these other opportunities to create variation within them. And I'm not saying that people who make 64-step sequences don't do that. You're probably getting extremely versatile performances if you're doing both of those things. But I tend to make sort of 16 or 32-step at the most, and then use some of these modulation options to control things within them and create that versatility. The other thing you need to remember too is that when you've got an external source coming into a part and you start playing with that external source, if you're modulating more than one part, then you've got the opportunity for that modulation to impact upon more outputs than one, right? You could have it to multiple things. Like I could be modulating my pitch opportunities on a monophonic synth part, but also modulating my ratchet events in a drum part, and I could have them set inversely to each other so that when the pitch is most active there are fewer ratchets, and when the pitch modulation is least active there are more ratchets. And that way, that's just an example, you don't have to use ratchets, but it's an example of creating some dynamics in your music. When more of one thing is happening, I want less of another thing, or vice versa. Or you could just have more of everything at the same time, depending on what you're doing. But yeah, I think I've covered a few things there, and hopefully it's useful.
Excellent, thanks, Steve.
Yeah, super useful.
All right, so we're way over our usual limit here on time, but
we did say still deep dive.
Yeah,
well,
we're going for records here. So I'm gonna talk about just a few other things and briefly show them. And then we'll come back in a future deep dive and provide more detail. So another big addition for 2.0 are tunings. So on the sequence control page, everybody take a drink. Here we go. There we go. All right. On the second page, where we also have key and scale, there is this tune setting, which is tunings, and there are a few different reasons you might want to jump into an alternate tuning, and I'll discuss those as I go through them briefly. There are several built-in tunings, and it's also possible to load tunings from MIDI tuning specification files, which are MIDI files that contain a tuning. And I also have a a thing to do this probably this coming week is to make a little tutorial video or something on that. All right, so normal tuning is equal temperament 12 tones per octave. There are 3 tunings that change the notes you see. So intervals, note numbers, and these are MIDI note numbers, and voltage readout -3 to +7. So these don't change the tuning, these just change how you see things. And this is useful for different things. If you want to use a pitch source as a generic modulation source and work in voltages, this is useful. Or if you really want to you want to be in a standard tuning but not see note names, then numbers are a good way to go. And then moving up from there, we have 2 more voltage tunings, -3 to +3 and 0 to 5. Again, these are really useful for using modulation, pitch outputs as modulation sources. And then we have a series of equal temperament scales that have more than 12 tones per octave. So we have 13, 14, 15, 16, 19, 24, and 31. And 31 is tones per octave is a particularly interesting scale in terms of how it sounds. And let's see, mute part 2, go back to part 1. Let's just reset this so I can... Turn that on. That always helps. So 31 tones per octave, if you've never worked with an alternate tuning, is a really interesting one to start with because it's weird, but it doesn't sound terribly out of tune. And I am not knowledgeable enough on alternate tunings to really say why, but it's a really interesting tuning to play with just by ear. All right, moving on. We have some tunings that were generously donated by Robert Rich, who does, he's a microtuning specialist and has done tunings for several synthesizers. And I won't go into these in detail, but this one's called Harmonic 12, Harmonic 60, just intonated scale in 7. Lat 35 is another just intonated scale, so is Lat 37. Mean tone temperament. Other music's, I think this is a JI scale. Harry Partch's 43 tones per octave scale. And this is a pair of gamelan scales mixed together, P-log and Slendro. This is a Pythagorean scale. And then there's 2 more spots here for MTS scales, MTS tunings. So that's an interesting thing to explore if you have not yet. Particularly if you, in addition to working off the grid, you like to work off of the standard tuning areas. All right, and then a couple of preference-related items. There are sleep controls, so the OLEDs shouldn't be running for days on end. So by default, I think it's set for a 5-minute sleep time, and you can adjust that here. And you can also say sleep after 5 minutes unless I'm running, which is kind of what I usually leave it on. And then on stop, so this is for scenes and presets. So the common workflow issue if you're in scenes and you've started, I don't think I have any presets here, but if you started with several scenes and you're constantly stopping and starting, and it's sometimes handy to have it reset and sometimes not. So if you set on stop as is, it will not reset your scenes. Or you can say on stop, always go to scene 1. And if you're working with playlists, it's useful to have this setting where it'll force playlists in scene 1 back to the preset, the first preset. So that's kind of a tweaky thing that doesn't really come into play until you start doing a lot of arrangement-oriented stuff. And then one more item is ENC switch, which is encoder switch. And this allows you to customize what happens when you push the encoders. Back in, I don't know, 1.4 something, pushing encoders always followed the skip, mute, and select modes, but now they have a preference which is default to mutes. So you can use white buttons for skips and the encoders for mutes, or they can be fixed at skips, mutes, selects. They can be fixed to select a part, so I can quickly flip between parts, particularly handy if you don't have a Launchpad. And lastly, they can just be off if you're like one of my friends who, likes to rest his hands on the vector while he's manipulating other modules. Okay, that is pretty much everything.
Wow, nice work. There's so many updates in there that I'm going to go back and review to implement in my setup, especially that last little section of resetting the presets and parts to follow the other parts. It's nice to kind of tie all those things together and make them syncopate a little bit more formulaic, if you will.
Yeah. I mean, it's, I'm very interested in these kind of fine-tuning things that just, little things can make a big difference on the workflow. And, and I appreciate everybody sending me their feedbacks, their requests, their bug reports. I can't always respond quickly. I'm not going to say I'm terrible with emails, but I'm constantly struggling to catch up with all the emails. But I do try and go through and read them all. And and of course on the forum there's a big feature request section. I rarely reply there, but I do go through and read them. And on my list for next week is to go through and kind of read through everything again and start sorting things into the what's next soon and the what next later pile. It's great fun working on this, and 2.0 is great, and we're just going to keep working on and making it better.
I mean, it sounds like you're already talking about 2.1. We should just let 2.0 marinate for a little while, right? Let Jim get a hike once in a while.
Yeah. Well, 2.0 is out the door. We have a couple little things to look at. Steve's good at helping me find those when I'm making demos, and and we have a couple on emails. But it's all good, and let's check the chat line one more thing, see if we have any last minute questions.
Yeah, so far we're looking pretty good. Couple of little chatter things, but mostly just folks having fun.
Okay, great.
Steve mentioned something about controlling dynamics, and that's kind of a neat way to modulate from external sources.
So the best way to... Sorry, you go, Cody.
I was just mentioning a few more comments, but it'll probably move us away from this topic. So go ahead, Steve.
Yep. So if you do find bugs, or if you do have some feature requests, there's a few different things you can do. Sometimes it's useful to talk about bugs in the Facebook group or on the 512 forum, because you can see if other users can replicate them, or maybe it's not a bug, it's just a different use case or a different way of using things, so we can socialize them there and look at them. But if it is legitimately a bug or some kind of technical issue, then the best thing to do is to email Jim at 512. And Jim's very responsive with the bug type stuff. As far as feature requests and so on goes, the best way to bring those to people's attention is within the forum on the 512 group. The actual website, the forum at the 512 website is the best place to put feature requests and so on. As far as if you just want help checking out how things work, absolutely you can message me via Facebook or whatever. I'm usually pretty keen to hear what people are trying to do, because sometimes it leads me in a direction of something new I can learn as well. And if it's something that's not possible, we can confirm that together. So yeah, I'm around. I'm here to help. But as far as actual, real fault problems go, that's via the 512.
Yeah. Email's the best way. info@512.com or jim@512.com, and I'll help you out. And then last thing to note before we wrap up is there are 3 new tutorial videos in the Vector 101 playlist on the 512 YouTube channel. I've got 2 or 3 more recorded to edit, and I'm going to be adding more and more throughout the week. Kind of my goal is to get through most of the 2.0 manual, and that'll cover basically the basics. In the deep dives, we're covering more of how things interact with each other, and also showcasing people's work and how they're using the vector. But these videos are focused specifically on new users trying to figure out, like, okay, how does this work? What are all the things that happen in the sequence control page and so forth?
Yeah. So I guess just as we're wrapping up, just as a user, Jim, I just want to say congratulations on your product roadmap and development here. I think there's a lot of excitement. I mean, we've had quite a lot of people logged into this chat today, and all the previous ones we've done as well. So I just want to say thank you as a user for making yourself available to the community and being so responsive to feature requests and generating those new video content. I think is going to help people as well. When I first bought my Vector, I bought it on the back of your reputation with numerology and so on, and it was just a sequence of 8 monophonic parts, which I still found incredibly useful. But now today it's got so much more to it as well, which is just fantastic to see that investment paying more and more dividends compositionally in the work that we do. So I just think on behalf of the user base, if not wanting to speak for anyone, but just want to say thank you very much for the continued development there. It's just been fantastic.
Awesome, thanks, Guy. So it's great to hear that. Yeah. Great to hear. So
yeah.
All right, folks, we're done for today, and we'll see you. I think we're on third Saturday afternoons, and we'll be back in May with a new deep dive, and I think maybe a couple surprises. So thanks again for tuning in. Hit us up on the Facebook group, 512 Vector Sequencer Users, or on the forum at, I think it's forum.512.net, or you can click on the forum link at 512.com, and we'll see you all again soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone, for joining.